There was a time, and this time is still remembered by old merchants who add to their stories, "It was different in my time," when the name Asterholm on a trade map weighed almost as much as gold itself. There was no need to explain where it was. No need to convince them whether it was worth the trip. The merchants deliberately made a detour of several days' travel, not because Asterholm was shorter, because there, in one square, more could be done in a day than in a week anywhere else. Silk from the east, salt from the coast, forged tools from mountain forges, live cattle, grain, tanned leather. And the buyers for all of this were right here, right now, no need to go anywhere else. The market was open from dawn until dark. The innkeepers had long since stopped counting their profits and simply raked the coins into sacks. Asterholm was the heart, the northern heart of the trading world. That was 12 years ago. There's silence there now. Not just any silence, a special, dense silence, the kind that only happens in places that used to be very noisy. The grass along the side of the main road has grown taller than a rider's wheel. The market square is empty. Not a stall, not a person, only an old awning leaning on one rotten post and waiting for the first stronger wind to finally fall with dignity. Of the 12 villages in the Duchy's lands, 8 are abandoned. Not destroyed, abandoned, exactly. The houses are standing, the roofs are holding, but the windows are dark, the doors have crumbling latches. And inside, there's that emptiness that remains when people leave and never return. This is where Kyle Astern rides in. Alone. Without an entourage, without a guard, without a single servant behind him. Riding a horse whose mane is so completely ingrained with the road dust from 3 weeks of travel that it's impossible to tell whether it's naturally gray or whether no one has been around to clean it for a long time. Kyle drives down the empty main street slowly, the way one drives through an unfamiliar city. Unhurriedly, looking around. And he looks, not with horror, not with longing, with the cold, businesslike attention with which an experienced builder examines ruins. Not mourning, but figuring out what else could be used here. He's 22 years old. No money, no army, no allies. But he has a duchy, or rather what's left of it. There's one man waiting for him at the castle gates. Gaston, the old butler, long overdue for retirement. But there's no one to hand him the keys. Everyone else has left. Some in the first year after the bankruptcy, some in the second. Some simply stopped coming when it became clear that there would be no more wages today or tomorrow. Gaston stayed. He stands straight as his age allows, in his uniform with elbows worn white, and looks at the young Duke with the expression of a man who has prepared himself for the worst. And that's exactly what he got. They enter the castle. The castle is alive, and that's almost deceptive. A ruined one would look honest, a disaster. Nothing can be done. It happens. This one is simply tired. Cobwebs litter the corners of the grand hall where once no one dared enter without an invitation. The gilding on the staircase railings is peeling like scales. Half the rooms are locked. There's nothing to heat them with, so there's no point in opening them. In the main office, there's a table, 2 chairs, the candles Gaston lit an hour ago, and a chill that hasn't gone away since autumn and shows no sign of stopping. Gaston places a scroll on the table. Not a single sheet, but a roll. The thick paper, 1.5 meters long, is covered on both sides in small, cramped handwriting. Debts. Names of creditors. Amounts. Payment deadlines that have long since passed. Interest on overdue amounts. Interest on interest. Everything is neat. Everything is stamped. Everything is legally impeccable. As always, happens with things you can't get rid of. Kyle takes the scroll. He reads. He doesn't skim through it. He reads, line by line, without rushing, without skipping a single page. Gaston stands nearby, looking at the floor. There's no need to memorize the numbers. They all mean the same thing. If you sell everything that's left in the duchy, the castle, the land, the forest, 4 living villages, people and livestock included, wouldn't be enough. Even at a good price. Even if buyers could be found for it all at once. Right now. This isn't a debtor's pit. It's a debtor's pit with a few tons of rocks dumped on top, just to be sure. Kyle reads to the last line. He folds the scroll neatly along the crease like a regular business letter. He puts it in the inside pocket of his jacket. Gaston says what he must say, carefully, as one says what one doesn't want to hear, but must. It's not too late to leave. It's not his fault. It accumulated under my father, under my grandfather, for years and decades. Shame now is better than shame later, and greater. There's still an opportunity to start somewhere else. Kyle stands by the window. He looks out at the empty market square, at the awning on one pole, at the weeds where the paved street should be. Then he turns around, and he smiles. Not the kind of smile you get when everything's going well, the kind that appears when everything's been calculated, and the calculations have come to fruition. Gaston looks at that smile and understands one thing. For the first time in a very long time, he doesn't know what will happen next. And the strangest thing is, for the first time in a very long time, it doesn't frighten him. For the next 3 days, Kyle doesn't leave his office. Maps, old expense ledgers, 15 years of business records, land registers, half of which are written in the handwriting of a long-dead clerk. Gaston sits opposite and answers questions, patiently, in detail, sometimes with the sorrow of a man who has seen it all with his own eyes, and it doesn't make it any easier. Kyle asks. Gaston answers. Kyle writes. The audit result is harsh, but clear. No surprises, just facts, lined up like a guilty verdict. 4 out of 12 villages are still alive. People are still there. Their houses are intact. They're growing something. They're somehow holding on. More out of habit than hope. 8 villages have been abandoned, and there is no point in returning people there while there is no road, no work, and no reason to return. The mine in the northeast is flooded. It sank underwater about 10 years ago after a collapse in the drainage galleries. Since then, no one has figured out why, and no one has tried to fix it. Too expensive, too complicated, too unnecessary. The main trade route is so broken that a heavy convoy would simply stop in the middle and not move. The bridge over the river on the eastern border burned down 3 winters ago. There was no money to rebuild it. The treasury is empty. Not almost empty, not little left. Empty, like a barrel that's been turned over and emptied. The last entry in the expense book was 8 months ago. A payment to 2 grooms, after which the grooms also left and never returned. The only asset that's listed on paper, yet no one has ever needed it, is the northern forest. A vast tract, ancient and so dark that even at midday, twilight lingers beneath the canopy. Peasants have not cut it down for generations. They say that spirits live there. You can't walk there. It's better not to look in that direction at all. There is no rational explanation for this fear for a long time. It's just the way it is. No one has checked, and the forest has stood untouched for hundreds of years. Everything else in the assets is paper. Beautiful documents with heraldic seals stating that the Duchy owns the rights to roads that no one drives on, to lands that no one cultivates, to fishing grounds that no one goes near. Rights exist. Everything else? No. On the 3rd day, the letters started arriving. Lots of them. Each creditor felt compelled to write personally, and each found their own way to say the same thing. You've waited too long, enough, pay up. One writes rudely and bluntly. Another expresses deep regret and a barely concealed hint of legal action. The third attached a copy of the debt agreement to the letter, in case they suddenly forgot in Asterholm what exactly they signed and when. Count Morden writes last. His letter is different. No pressure, no impatience. Elegant handwriting, fine paper with an embossed coat of arms, and polite, almost cold, language. Morden reports that he's been following the change in leadership in the Duchy with interest, and eagerly awaits an inventory of the property to determine the actual value of the collateral. Not a threat, not a demand, a business notification. As someone who's long considered this place his own and is simply waiting for the door to open, Kyle reads all the letters in order. He puts them in a stack. He sits down at the table and begins answering. Most of them get short answers. Accepted, obligations confirmed, payments will be made on time. No promises, no excuses, simply an acknowledgement of fact. It's enough to prevent anyone from starting legal proceedings prematurely and to prevent Astern's name from becoming synonymous with insolvent debtors before anything has even begun. Morden, a separate sheet. 1 paragraph. The gist. The Count will receive everything in full with interest over 3 years. If the term is unacceptable and the Count wishes to discuss it in person, the address is known. Gaston reads the reply. He stares at the paper for a long moment. He asks quietly if it's too much. Kyle seals the envelope. Morden receives the letter 4 days later. He reads it, rereads it. Then he leans back in his chair and laughs. Really, heartily. So much so that the advisor opposite him involuntarily stands up. The Count takes the letter again. He looks at the young Duke's signature. He thinks, the boy has gone mad. He doesn't know yet, and won't know for a long time. That's exactly what everyone who met Kyle Astern thought of him for the first time, and that everyone who thought that later regretted it. But for now, Morden is laughing, and quietly gives his advisor the order. Start buying up debt rights from small creditors. Quietly, through intermediaries. If a boy wants to play, let him play against one serious opponent, not 20 small ones. It's more interesting, and it's easier to control the outcome. While Kyle sat poring over his books for 3 days, the Duchy continued to crumble. One of the living villages sent its headman with a request. The spring sowing was in doubt. There wasn't enough grain. Previously, they had borrowed from the Duchy. Gaston explained that there was nowhere else to borrow. The light in the study burned until late at night. But there was one thing Kyle did at the end of the 3rd day. After closing the last book and neatly folding all the papers, he took a blank sheet of paper and wrote one question for himself. What is there here that isn't anywhere else? There was only one answer. The forest. On the 5th day, Kyle saddles his horse and rides west. Not across the lands, but to the nearest trading town on the Duchy's border. It hadn't fared well in the sack of Asterholm, but it survived. There are still people there. There's still a market, modest, cautious, but vibrant. Kyle goes alone, with no intention of buying or selling anything. For now, just to watch. The market is small, 24 stalls, 1/3 of which are empty. Trading is quiet, without unnecessary noise. They've long since learned here that loud trading attracts those who demand their share, and it's easier without it. Kyle walks slowly, unhurriedly between the aisles. Then he sees her. Alice Marsh runs the most modest stall in the market. A few scraps of fabric, a couple of boxes of change. Everything is neatly laid out. Everything is well kept, although there is little merchandise left and it's getting smaller every week. She's young, a little older than Kyle, maybe 2 years. Dark-haired, with a direct gaze and the look of a person who has long been accustomed to relying only on herself and is only stronger because of this. Her story is simple and unfair, like many others. Her father was a merchant, a good one, with a name, a reputation, and trade routes he spent 20 years building. One of the old Duke Astern's partners. He transported goods through the Duchy, paid duties, maintained warehouses on the territory, and had a position at the main market. When Asterholm began to decline, so did he. The routes closed. The money invested in warehouses and turnover vanished along with the trade. The debts remained. He dealt with them for 3 years. Honestly, to the last, selling off everything that could be sold. He died when he realized it. Not from illness, but simply from running out, like a fire when there's nothing left to burn. Alice received a clean slate and the remains of her wares after him. From then on, she was on her own. Kyle approaches the counter. Alice looks at him immediately and correctly. Not a customer. He's dressed in travel clothes, without insignia, without an entourage, but he carries himself like people accustomed to the space around them being theirs. A nobleman. And not the kind who comes to the market to buy anything interesting. Kyle offers her a job. Trade agent for the Duchy of Asterholm. Negotiating with merchants, finding buyers and suppliers, establishing trade relations from scratch. He speaks frankly, without embellishment. There is no salary yet. There is a share in future profits, as soon as they appear. Alice laughs. It's not offensive. It's just honest. The kind of laugh you get when you hear something that sounds like a sentence but actually means nothing. A Duchy's trading agent with no money, no market, no road. Nothing but debts the size of a small mountain and a reputation as a place where everyone has abandoned them. A share in a profit that doesn't exist and won't exist. An unknown amount. This isn't a job offer. It's an offer to share in someone else's misfortune. She laughs and looks at him, looks and falls silent. Because Kyle doesn't make excuses. He doesn't smile back. He doesn't begin to explain why everything is actually better than it seems. He simply stands and looks at her, calmly, evenly, with the same expression with which he rode into the empty, ruined castle. Without despair, without naivety, without a single unnecessary movement. A person who's already figured everything out and is waiting for the other person to catch up. Alice knows how to read people. She's been trading since childhood. She's heard thousands of promises, can distinguish between someone who says everything will work out because they believe it, and someone who says everything will work out because they know it. It's a different look in their eyes, a different silence, a different weight to their words. This one has the second ones. She removes the goods from the counter. She stands up. She tucks one of the boxes under her arm, practically, without unnecessary gestures. He asks in a businesslike manner as a partner would, not an employee, where to start and what exactly to sell first. Kyle looks north, at the dark strip of forest visible even from here above the city rooftops, old, vast, untouched. He replies, "For starters, the forest." Alice looks at the same forest, the cursed forest which peasants haven't entered for generations. Then she looks at Kyle. For a second, she's silent. And in that second, you can see something switch in her head. She still doesn't understand how exactly this will work, but she's already started thinking about how to do it. Later, in the evening, as they were returning to the border of the Duchy, Alice asked, almost under her breath, more thinking out loud than expecting an answer, who would want to buy wood from a cursed place? Kyle didn't answer right away. Then he said, "The one who needs the wood." Not her story. Alice thought for a second, nodded. It was the first moment she realized she thought in the same language as him. And one more thing had been bothering her all the way back. This man, ruined, without an army, without allies, with a debt that could not be repaid in 100 years, spoke of the future not as a hope. He spoke of it as a schedule, not maybe or if it works out, simply what would be done, in what order, with what outcome. Alice had seen people like that once in her life. Her father had said of such people, "Fear them not when they shout, but when they are silent and counting." Kyle Astern was silent almost the entire ride, and he was counting something. The next morning, Kyle saddled his horse before dawn. Gaston rides alongside, not because he was called, but because he cannot leave the young Duke alone, neither as a servant nor as a person. The old man doesn't ask where they're going. The direction speaks for itself. North. The forest begins beyond the last living village, abruptly, like a wall. It's not like a forest usually begins. The field doesn't gradually thin out and the trees slowly emerge. Here, the boundary is clear. Here's the meadow, and there are already the first tree trunks. There's a path, an old one, overgrown at the edges, but it's there. People used to walk along it, long ago. The villagers, seeing where they're going, stop. They watch them go. Nobody shouts anything. They just remain silent and look with the expression with which they look at something that can no longer be stopped. It gets dark immediately under the first treetops. Not like twilight. Different. There's light, it filters through the leaves and falls in patches on the ground. But the space between the trees is dense, dark, alive. And the silence here is its own. Not like the empty streets of Asterholm. That one was dead. This one breathes. The trees are old, very old. Kyle stops his horse at the first large trunk, 3 meters in circumference, the bark dark and dense, without a single trace of an axe or saw. He dismounts. He comes up close. He places his palm on the bark, just like that, studying the texture, looking at the way the branches lie. Gaston looks at him, not understanding a thing, but Kyle already sees what the old man does not see and cannot see. Because he looks not through the eyes of a man who is afraid, but through the eyes of a man who can count. He recognized the species from the first trunks on the edge. a special variety of northern oak, known in port cities as ship oak, and sold at prices that make carpenters' jaws drop. Hard as rock, doesn't rot in salt water, can withstand loads better than any other wood on the continent. The Royal Navy is built from it, palace floors, furniture, and there are thousands of hectares of it here. Untouched, centuries old, so much so that a single mature trunk is worth more than a farmer sees in a year's work. Kyle takes a measuring rope, a notebook, and some charcoal from his saddlebag. Gaston watches silently. Kyle spends the next few hours working. Methodically, without rushing, he measures the trunks, counts the trees in the visible area, estimates the depth of the forest. He writes it down. He measures again. He writes it down again. He doesn't look like a man looking for a way out. He looks like a man who's found something and is now assessing the scale of his discovery. While he was counting, something small but telling happened in the forest. A squirrel ran along a tree trunk above his head. The bird flew close, almost unafraid. The forest hadn't seen people in a long time and had forgotten that they were something to be afraid of. This meant one thing. It was untouched, not only on the outside, but also on the inside. A completely untouched massif. Kyle wrote down this observation too on a separate line with a note. By midday, a picture had formed. It wasn't exact, but it was sufficient for a first conversation with the buyer. Kyle closes his notebook. He stands motionless for a few seconds, staring into the depths, where the trail has long since disappeared and where light barely reaches. The forest goes deep for tens of kilometers. All of it is untouched. All of it is his. Then he turns around and drives back. Gaston can't resist asking what exactly he was calculating. Kyle explains briefly. The breed, the market price in the capital, the approximate volume, and what follows from that. Gaston listens, digests, then quietly utters one phrase, that it all just stood there. All these years, just stood there. Kyle. Yes. As they approach the castle, Gaston is the first to notice the strange horses at the gate. 8 of them. Saddled, their blankets gray-green with black trim. Morden's men. They didn't wait for an invitation. They were already inside the courtyard. Kyle tucked the notebook deeper into his shirt. He straightened in the saddle. He drives through the gates, slowly, as if the owners of the house had no right to rush them. Strangers are standing in the courtyard. One of them, a stocky man with a well-fed face, holds papers and looks at the Duke as he enters without the slightest embarrassment. The way one looks at a man who has come to be described. Behind Kyle, Gaston quietly says, "Those are Morden's colors." He says it as if warning him, though Kyle had already figured it out. On the way from the forest to the castle, he thought about one thing. What he had. The forest. Rock samples in the saddlebag, numbers in the notebook, and the law. He rides into the courtyard, dismounts. He doesn't rush the guests or ignore them. He walks toward them. There are 8 of them. They stand in the center of the courtyard, like people accustomed to the space being theirs. The elder introduces himself without much ceremony. An authorized representative of the Earl of Morden, he has arrived for a preliminary inventory of the property and an assessment of the assets to pay off the debt obligations of the Duchy. There's no harshness in his voice. There's something worse than harshness, a complete lack of doubt. He doesn't think he could be refused. He doesn't even consider that possibility. He unfolds the papers. He begins to read out the list. The castle, outbuildings, land, livestock, inventory, forest rights. Methodically, line by line, Gaston stands slightly behind and slightly to the side. His fingers are clenched. He's old, but he holds up well, just quietly without a word. Kyle listens to the end. He doesn't interrupt. When the list ends, he says one thing. Wait. He enters the castle. 3 minutes later, he emerges with a document. Not a scroll, but a sheet of thick paper neatly folded. He hands it to the commissioner. He takes it, reads, rereads. It's an extract from the Royal Code on the Rights of Territorial Rulers. The article is specific. Until the moment of official delay in payment, No creditor has the right to inventory, seize, or evaluate the debtor's property without his written consent. The commissioner read the document twice. It was a telling pause. The man was stalling, pretending to look for a loophole, even though there was none. Kyle found it on page 4 of a legal code that lay buried under a layer of dust in the castle library. The commissioner returned the document. This was what was truly dangerous. Legally, that was it. The conversation was over. The authorized representative folded the paper. He handed it back. There was no confusion or anger on his face. He says quietly that the count will be notified, that the next visit will take place within the time frame established by law. And then he adds, even more quietly, for Kyle alone, that the count hasn't forgotten. 8 people gather without haste. They mount their horses. They ride out of the gates carefully, one at a time. The last one lingers at the gates a second longer than necessary. He looks at Kyle. Silence returns to the courtyard. Gaston remains silent for a long moment. Then he says, not loudly, but very clearly, that in all the years he's served in this castle, he's never seen Estern fail to retreat. My father gave in. My grandfather gave in. Those who came before him, too. There was always a reason. The opponent was too strong, the moment too inopportune, too many risks. Always. Kyle looks out the gate through which Morden's men departed. He doesn't answer. The evening passes quietly. They dine alone, Kyle, Gaston, and the meager table. In the middle of the night, Kyle is awakened by a smell. He knows the smell before he even opens his eyes. Wood. Burning, dry wood. The warehouse in the backyard, small, almost empty, but with the remains of tools and grain, is burning steadily and confidently. It's not a random fire. Kyle stands in the courtyard looking at the fire. His face is calm. Only his eyes are a little darker than usual. Gaston is nearby. He's shivering, but not from the cold. There's nothing to put out the fire with and no one to help. But they try, using buckets from the well, until the fire burns out on its own. By dawn, all that's left of the warehouse is a blackened hulk. Kyle looks at him for a long time. Then he goes to wash up. The day begins. Gaston watches him go. He's thinking about 2 things at once. First, who started the fire? It's not a question. It's clear who. The people of Morden don't forget, that's true. And the first thing they did after a polite refusal was set fire to the house. Clean, anonymous, without evidence. That's how people who know how to wait work. The second. Kyle walked out into the yard and looked at the fire. Gaston had seen many reactions to disaster in his life. Panic, tears, rage, numbness. What he saw in Kyle didn't fit any of those descriptions. It was like a man looking at the task he was expecting. When dawn broke, strangers were already standing by the blackened skeleton of the warehouse. Not soldiers. Peasants, about 20 of them from a nearby village. They came on their own, uninvited. They brought buckets, some even shovels. They stood there silently, looking at what was left. When Kyle stepped out into the yard, they turned around. Among them was Dora, the village elder, a woman of about 50 years old, as strong as anything that has stood for a long time in the open air. She explained to Kyle without preamble. They saw the glow one night and decided to come and see. And she added what others had hesitated to. The village had long been saying that the new duke was unlike those who came before him. Kyle listened. He thanked them without further ado. He asked for help sorting out what was left. The men took it upon themselves without objection. He worked alongside them. Gaston looked at it with the expression of a man who finds it difficult to determine what he sees. Heroism, madness, or something else. At first, the peasants worked in silence. Then they began to talk. Then someone joked, carefully, in a low voice. No one laughed out loud, but the air changed slightly. By mid-morning, the yard was cleared. Kyle looked at the results, then at the people getting ready to leave. Dora had already turned toward the gate. He stopped her with a single word, and said what no one present expected to hear from a duke who had no money, no army, and nothing. 3 years. 3 years of complete exemption from all ducal taxes and duties. For all villages that agree to help with the work in the northern forest. Dora listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was silent for about 10 seconds. It wasn't hesitation. It was a test. She looked at him the way one looks at someone who has just said something important. Then she nodded. Briefly, without ceremony. She turned to her people. She said something in a low voice. They nodded too. When the villagers left, voices were heard outside the gate. A letter arrived at noon. Duke Velen, a neighbor to the east, the owner of rich trading lands, and a man who had watched Asterholm's death throes with polite distance for the past few years. The letter was exquisite. Beautiful paper, a respectful tone, words of condolence about the misfortune that occurred with the outbuildings. Velen, of course, already knew about the fire, and then came the proposal. Velen expressed interest in joint development of forest lands and was willing to consider a fair deal that would allow Asterholm to resolve some of his debt obligations. A fair deal meant one thing: buy the forest for a third of the price while the Duke was weak and had no choice. Take the most valuable asset, the one Kyle had only just found and valued yesterday. Kyle read the letter once. He walked over to the candle on the table and held a corner of the paper to the flame. Gaston watched as Duke Velen's letter burned. Kyle stared at the fire until the paper burned down to his fingers. The day wasn't over yet, but the Duchy already had something it hadn't had yesterday. People who had come on their own. Gaston thought about this that evening as he cleared the table. About how sometimes what looks like a loss, the burned-out warehouse, Morden's men, Velen's brazen letter, is actually a test. Outside the gate, while Kyle was cleaning up the ashes from the letter, Alice was already thinking about the shipbuilders. She returned in the evening with a short report. 2 major shipbuilders in the capital are complaining about rising prices for ship timber. The Navy is ordering more, and suppliers can't keep up. The third one even turned down several contracts due to a lack of materials. Kyle listened. He nodded. He said one thing: get the samples ready for shipment. Alice looked at him for a second. Then she went to cook. Gaston, observing this brief conversation, caught himself thinking strangely. Just a week ago, he had been certain the Duchy could not be saved. Now he was no longer sure of anything. And this, as he had long known from experience, was the first sign that something was beginning to change. Maybe he knew. Alice returned from the capital on the 3rd day, earlier than Kyle expected. That said something. Either she hadn't found anything and was returning empty-handed, or she had found it and was in a hurry. Second, she brought back more than just rumors, specifics. The Royal Navy received an expanded construction budget, 3 new frigates, 2 transport ships, and talk of a 4th frigate by next year. Moscow shipbuilders are so overloaded that some are already turning down new orders. Everyone faces the same main problem: timber. There's a shortage of good quality marine timber, and prices have nearly doubled. And those suppliers who are working steadily have contracts already booked for 2 years in advance. There's demand, but no supply. Kyle listened standing without interrupting. When Alice finished, I asked one question: who's the best? She answered without hesitation: Haas. Theodore Haas, a veteran shipbuilder with a 20-year reputation. He is difficult to negotiate with, disdainful of low-quality materials, and has publicly refused several deals with aristocrats who tried to sell him second-class work at the price of first class. But if Haas puts his stamp on it, it means the ship won't sink. That's exactly what they needed. Kyle unpacked the samples, 4 cut logs from different parts of the northern forest. Each one with markings for the location and depth of the cut. He handed them over to Alice, along with the terms. She was going to see 3 major shipbuilders, including Haas. The offer is the same for everyone. Down payment now, timber delivery in 6 months. Not we'll discuss it, not we'll send samples for evaluation. Money up front. The price was market price minus 10% for the speed of the transaction. Alice looked at him with the expression of someone who knew this would either work brilliantly or not at all. She took the samples and left. Haas saw her the next day, out of politeness, as he later told his assistant. An offer from a ruined duchy, worthless in itself, demanding an advance payment as if there was a line waiting for it. Ridiculous. What can you say? He intended to listen and politely decline. Then he picked up the sample. He twisted it. He ran his thumb across the grain. He looked at the cross-section in the window light. He tapped the end with his knuckle. Good ship oak has a unique sound, dull and dense like stone. This one sounded right. Very right. Haas ran his fingernail over the surface again. The hardness was so great that it left almost no mark. He'd been working with wood for 40 years. He hadn't seen this kind of wood in 25 years, maybe 30. He knew her the way one knows something one has been searching for. Immediately, unmistakably, without a doubt. A special kind of northern oak, the kind used to build ships that never sink. The last time Haas handled such wood was back under the old naval contract. A supplier from the far coast delivered enough for 2 corvettes. Since then, it's been almost the same. Compromises. And this wasn't a compromise. He tapped his knuckle on the end. The sound was dull, dense, like that of a good stone. He ran his fingernail across the grain. The mark was barely visible. He sniffed the cut. Dry wood, mature, without a hint of rot, with that resinous note that speaks volumes about the species better than any paper. He named a price, lower than he asked. That was his principle. Alice didn't give in immediately. She haggled. They settled on a figure Kyle identified as the lower limit of what was acceptable. The advance arrived in Asterholm 3 days later, in cash, by messenger. Kyle spread the coins out on the table. He counted them. I divided it into 3 parts without hesitation. The first goes to the first creditor on the list, exactly on time, exactly in the amount of the minimum payment. The second is for hiring 30 lumberjacks, tools, and expenses for the first month of work in the forest. The third is for reserves. It's small, but there is one. Gaston watched Kyle do this and thought, he'd clearly already made this decision. The money hadn't arrived yet, but he already knew where it would go. The receipt for the debt payment was sent to the creditor. A copy was sent to Morden as the senior creditor, according to the minutes. Morden received it on Tuesday. He unfolded it. Read it. Put it aside. Picked it up again. In his life, he had seen many debtors. Smart ones and not so smart ones. Those who paid and those who never paid. He'd long ago developed an internal classification system. A few facts were enough to understand who you were dealing with. Young Astern didn't fit into any category. That in itself was information, and not the most convenient. Then he picked it up again. Something about the piece of paper was bothering him. He called his secretary and asked for the full dossier on Kyle Astern. Origin, education, connections, everything. The dossier turned out to be thin, almost nothing. Young, without significant connections, no military experience, no political history. Nobody. Morden looked at the receipt again. At the date. At the amount. Exactly as agreed. Not a coin more, not a coin less. At the neat signature at the bottom. For the first time in his entire time on this case, Count Morden was unsure of what exactly was happening. It was an unpleasant, unfamiliar sensation. He put the file away. He asked his secretary to keep Asterholm under surveillance, more closely than before. The mine was located on the northeastern edge of the Duchy. It took half a day to get there along a bumpy road, which eventually ceased to be a road at all and turned into a path through the bushes. Kyle took one man with him, Peter. The old miner lived in the nearest abandoned village. He didn't leave when others did. He stayed because he had nowhere else to go, and the mine was his life. When Peter realized where they were going, he said everything he thought in one sentence. Nothing to see there. Kyle nodded and kept driving. Peter followed behind, looking like a man who had been told that his opinion had been taken into account and ignored. The mine entrance suddenly emerged from the undergrowth, a large rectangular portal lined with stone, with a collapsed lifting frame across it. Everything else was underwater. The dark surface began already on the 3rd step of the stairs and went so far down that the flashlight couldn't reach it. Still water. Stale air. Peter gestured. Look, it's exactly as he said. Kyle stared down for about 3 minutes, silently, his expression unchanging. Then he asked a question Peter hadn't expected. Why had the water risen? Peter opened his mouth, then closed it. It was a question no one had asked him in 10 years. Everyone, the new manager, the old one, and the creditors, all looked at the water and concluded, the mine is flooded, forget it. No one asked why, but the question had been asked. And Peter, who had never been given the chance to answer it, suddenly discovered he had the answer. He just never said it out loud. The main drainage channel, the one that ran under the eastern wall of the shaft and carried water outside. It was supported by wooden formwork, heavy logs. Sooner or later, they were bound to rot. The canal collapsed. The water stopped draining. It had risen over several rainy seasons to its current level. Not a disaster, a mechanical failure. Fixable. Kyle pulled out a notebook before Peter had finished speaking. He asked him to describe the channel's location, its approximate depth, and the slope. Peter answered, first cautiously, then enthusiastically. His memory was precise. He remembered every detail of the construction as one remembers something built with one's own hands. Kyle drew, not neatly, but precisely. The drainage plan was taking shape right there at the mine entrance by the light of a flashlight on a notebook page. Expensive, difficult, long, but possible. Peter looked at the drawing and felt a feeling he couldn't immediately name. Then he found one. It was something akin to hope. As they finished their inspection, Peter remembered, as if it had just come to him, the old box. Wooden, covered in resin, it had stood in a niche near the entrance before he'd arrived at the mine. Long forgotten because there were only papers inside. Who needs papers in a mine? They dragged it up and broke the rusty lock. Inside are documents wrapped in oiled canvas, almost dry. A map. The original engineering plan of the mine. The one drawn up when it was first dug, several generations ago. Kyle unrolled it on a flat stone. He studied it carefully. Then again, more slowly, from the very beginning. On the map, in the very bottom layer, 2 strata were marked. Others, off to the side, were neatly marked with the first engineer's notes. These were specific marks, the kind used when silver-bearing minerals are detected in the rock. The seams had never been mined. They were too deep, too expensive to reach, given the resources available at the time. Kyle sat over the map for a long time. Peter waited nearby. Then Kyle folded the map, carefully along the old fold lines, and tucked it into his bosom under his waistcoat. He stood up. He asked Peter how many men were needed to begin the drainage work. They barely spoke on the way back. Peter rode alongside her, wearing that expression you get when something long thought closed suddenly opens a crack. Kyle drove in silence, thinking about the map, about the 2 seams in the lower tier, about how silver-bearing ore isn't something you talk about out loud on the highway. That drainage work should be started not because it's faster, but because it's precisely under the noise of drainage that we can prepare for what's most important. Some things are valuable precisely when no one knows about them. They barely spoke on the way back. Peter rode alongside her, thinking about how the new Duke had asked one good question and received in return a map that was perhaps worth more than all the visible assets of the Duchy. I also thought that this question could have been asked any time in the last 10 years. No one asked. A cloud of dust was spotted on the eastern road 10 minutes before Velen himself arrived. A cloud like that couldn't be raised by one traveler, nor by 3. Gaston, standing at the gate, counted 30 horses, maybe a little more. 2 pennants in the colors of the Duchy of Velen, guards in their uniform cloaks, 2 in counselors' robes, a personal steward with leather folders. The owner's white stallion, the only white one in the entire column, was purposely chosen to be the first to be seen. This wasn't a visit. It was a performance. Velen rode through the gates of Asterholm with the air of a man doing a favor just by appearing. He was young, about 30, well-groomed with an even tan. Kyle met him at the gate. Alone, without an entourage, against 30 men. It was also a position, though it looked different. Velen expressed a desire to explore the Duchy. Kyle personally led him through the lands, through empty villages, along a rutted road, along the edge of the forest, where the first blows of axes could already be heard. His eyes worked separately from his words. They assessed. The land, fertile. The forest, very interesting. The villages could be restored. The road, the investment was small, the return obvious. He looked at it all the way one looks at a house one has almost bought. When they returned to the castle, Gaston was already waiting in the grand hall. No one entering this hall would have said with certainty that the rest of the castle was held together by frost resistance and old loyalty. Velen entered. He looked around. Something in his expression changed slightly. He expected ruin and found dignity. This wasn't what he'd planned. They sat down. Velen's advisor opened the folder. The conversation began, or rather the announcement of the terms of surrender, beautifully packaged. The proposal was simple. Velen would invest the money, take on the debts and restoration. Kyle would retain the title and receive a salary. The trading rights, the forest, and the mine would be transferred to Velen's control. Velen presented this in 3 different formulations, each time slightly altering the emphasis. The first as assistance, the second as mutual benefit. The third with a gentle mention of what would happen if the debts continued to accumulate. Kyle listened to all 3 options in their entirety, without interrupting once. Then he refused. Once. Without explanation, without apology, without negotiating the terms. Velen tried again. Kyle refused again, with the same 3 words, but with different words that meant the same thing. The conversation ended. Velen stood up, his smile still there, his tone even. Kyle rose as well. He escorted his guest to the hall doors, as befits a host. And already at the door, when Velen was almost out, he said one thing, a single phrase, spoken in a level voice without emphasis, almost boringly. In 2 years, he said, Velen's merchants will be queuing at the gates of Asterholm themselves. Velen paused for a second, turned around, looked at Kyle. Then he laughed. A real, broad, hearty laugh, so loud that the guards at the gate involuntarily exchanged glances. His advisor smiled. The steward hid his grin behind a raised folder. Everyone laughed. It was natural, because it was funny. A ruined duchy with debts, 4 living villages and no army means that in 2 years it will have a queue of merchants from the neighboring rich duchy. The column left the gates the same way it had entered. Slowly, with dignity, with the dust rising from the 30 horses. Velen's chief advisor rode slightly behind his master. He didn't laugh. Not because he was a gloomy man. It's just that in his line of work, laughing at people was an expensive habit. He was thinking. He went over in his head everything he had seen today. The hall, the lumberjacks in the northern forest, the horses at the mine that they had noticed along the way, the young duke's gaze in the doorway. That look. There was no resentment, no passion, no desire to prove anything. Only the calm of a man who had stated a fact. Not a threat, not a wish, but simply a fact. And now he's waiting for time to prove him right. The advisor took out a small notebook. He wrote 3 words. Asterholm. Observe. Urgent. The first year in Asterholm ended quietly, without celebration or disaster. One morning, Kyle simply sat down and took stock. Les was working. The 30 lumberjacks recruited in the fall became 50 by winter. Rumors of fair pay spread faster than any letter. The first shipment of ship oak left for Haas on schedule, and the second was on its way. 3 of the 4 villages were truly alive. Families returned, roofs were repaired, and fields were plowed. A small market sprang up at the crossroads near the castle. 5 stalls, then 8, then 12. No one organized it. People simply felt it made sense to bring goods. 30% of the debt was paid, right on time, without a single day's delay. That was a lot. That was very little. The remaining 70% hung over the duchy as heavily as before. But something had changed, not in the numbers, but in the way people viewed Kyle. They didn't turn away. They didn't hide their eyes with that special expression you get when you're looking at someone you already wish well. From a distance, without any intimacy. They looked straight ahead. Some nodded. One morning, Dora from the nearby village came over and reported that this year's harvest was better than last year's. Kyle wrote down the year's results in one column. What's there? What's not? What's possible? I stared at it for a long time. The balance was uneven. The way the score can be uneven in the middle of a game when you're down, but the direction is right. The main thing is, the debt hasn't grown, which means the pace can be maintained. These are small things. But Gaston, who had seen the Duchy through many eras, knew. It's with these small things that trust begins. Then came the news from Alice. She was doing something she wasn't assigned to, but did on her own. Keeping an ear to the ground in the capital, among merchants, among banking intermediaries. And what she brought demanded attention. Morden hadn't been idle all this time. Quietly, through a chain of intermediaries, he was buying up debt rights from small creditors, those who were tired of waiting and were glad to get something right now. 7 of the 12 original creditors have already sold their claims. The result? 70% of Astorholm's entire debt was in one hand. Alice asked point blank if that was alarming. Kyle looked at the list. Then he replied, "That means the enemy has become visible. Before, there were many opponents, and they were blurred. Now there's only one, and he's on the map." This wasn't bravado. It was logic. Alice explained the mechanism. Small creditors were tired of waiting and were happy to receive 70% of the face value right now instead of 100% sometime later. Morden bought their impatience. He's gained control. Now he's not just one of many creditors. He's the only voice that carries weight. If he wants to demand early repayment through the courts, he has grounds. If he wants to make up an excuse, he now has enough influence to come up with one. Kyle listened to all this standing by the window. Then he uttered 3 words, not to reassure Alice, but for himself. He recorded the fact and moved on. That same evening, a horseman appeared at the castle gates. Duncan arrived unannounced, simply appearing at the gate in the twilight, alone, in battered travel armor, with a horse that was clearly as old on the road as its owner. He was one of those people who look the same at 30 and at 40, large, sinewy, with the face of a man who has long been accustomed to doing, not talking. 3 years ago, he left Astorholm. No scandal or explanation. One morning, his armor simply disappeared from its hook in the barracks, and he himself disappeared from the barracks yard. They hadn't paid his salary for 6 months. There was nothing to eat. Staying meant dying along with the Duchy. He left. He worked for 2 barons in the south. A decent job, decent pay. Then rumors came. Strange at first, then interesting. Duke Astern, 22, was building a road with his own hands. He was a timber merchant. He was paying off his debts. Rumors of this kind spread especially quickly in certain circles. Duncan expected a cold reception, perhaps a formal conversation, perhaps a reprimand. Kyle walked out into the courtyard, looked at him, and said one thing. "It's good that you came." After that, he simply turned and walked back into the castle. It was worse than any reprimand, and better than any forgiveness. Duncan didn't know what to do with it. He caught up with Kyle in the hallway. He asked, not apologetically, just honestly, why? Why did he take her back without saying a word about what happened? Kyle stopped. He looked west, toward the forest, which wasn't visible from here, but both knew it was there. Gaston, who had been watching all this from the corridor, thought about one thing for a long time afterward, that in 40 years of service he'd seen people leave and never seen them welcomed back like this, without scenes, without explanations, without a list of conditions. Simply put, it's good that he came. Kyle either knew how to forgive with an ease that was beyond his capabilities, or he saw Duncan not as a person who had left, but as someone who was needed. The difference was fundamental. He answered briefly, "I'll need a sword soon." Duncan was silent for a second. Then he nodded. And with that nod, his second tour of duty in Astorholm began. No papers, no oath. Just a nod. The main trade route through Astorholm was once an artery. Not figuratively, but literally. It was the lifeblood of the northern trade. two major cities on opposite sides of the Duchy, and the shortest route between them is through Asterholm. In the past, merchants didn't just travel through it, they planned stops. 8 years ago, they stopped repairing the road. 2 years later, it was impossible to drive on it during the rainy season. The wheels sank into mud up to the hubs, and carts broke their axles. The merchants reorganized. The new route was 3 days longer, but it didn't kill the horses or the wheeled vehicle. Asterholm, from a dot on the map, became a blank spot. 3 days' travel isn't just an inconvenience. It's a week's worth of goods in transit instead of 4. It means feed for the horses, overnight accommodations for the drivers, and losses from spoilage of perishable goods. Any merchant would want a shorter route if there was a road. Kyle announced the road's restoration in early spring. The announcement had an effect he didn't expect. The very next day, 7 men from a nearby village came to him, uninvited, and asked when they would start. Kyle laid out the terms. A fixed daily wage, paid weekly. The men exchanged glances. Weekly was a word unheard of in these parts for a master's hire. By the end of the week, 40 people were already working. The main problem quickly became apparent. The road needed crushed stone and rock. Lots of it. But there was no money to buy it. Forest revenues were strictly allocated and reserves were small. Kyle stared at the map for 3 evenings in a row. Then he drove around several abandoned villages and returned with an answer. The stone was there. A lot of it. It lay in the form of the walls of 8 empty villages, the foundations of abandoned houses, and the ruins of old outbuildings. There was no need to transport the material anywhere. It was necessary to dismantle what had crumbled anyway and put it back where it was needed. 1 blow, 2 results. Clean earth where the ruins had stood, and ready-made crushed stone for the road. In the morning, when the workers gathered at the first ruin, Kyle picked up the handles of the wheelbarrow. It was a sight to behold. The Duke of Asterholm, with his title and coat of arms, was standing with the wheelbarrow. He grabbed the handles the way he really does, with a wide grip, leaning forward, shifting his weight. He loaded the stones. He stood up. He rolled. Nobody moved for about 10 seconds. Dora was the first to emerge from her stupor. Silently, she picked up a shovel, walked over to the pile of rubble, and began loading the second wheelbarrow. 2 men followed, then 5 at once, then everyone. By midday, work was in full swing. The peasants didn't work as they would under duress, without fire, without urgency, just to get away. It was different here. Kyle watched this for a few days and realized the difference. People were seeing results. Every day, the road grew a few meters longer. Every day, the ruin that had stood like a dead tooth in the middle of the village for years disappeared, stone by stone. It gave me the feeling of doing something real. By the end of summer, the first section of the road, 12 kilometers from the castle to the eastern entrance, was ready. Not perfectly smooth, but firm, well-drained with wide shoulders. The first merchant convoy passed along it at the end of August. The driver stopped at the edge, touched the hard surface with his boot, muttered something approving and moved on. Kyle drove alongside everyone else, not just for an hour or 2, but the entire first day. By evening, his hands were red. His palms were calloused where they hadn't been before. Gaston saw this at dinner and said nothing. He simply placed a cup of hot water and a piece of cloth on the table and turned away. On the 3rd day, people arrived from a village that was already beyond the duchy's border. They heard about work, about fair pay, about the Duke with a wheelbarrow. They came to ask if they could do the same. Kyle hired everyone. Dora kept track of the workers herself. Kyle suggested it, and she agreed with the air of someone who's long had a knack for something no one had ever asked of her. Her ledger was more accurate than that of any castle clerk. On Fridays, she'd come with a sheet, Kyle would check it and pay it. Not once all summer did the figures differ by a single coin. The fact that Asterholm wasn't being shortchanged was now the talk of the 3 neighboring counties. Within 2 weeks, more than 120 people were working on the road construction. From 3 duchies. Gaston said one evening that he'd never seen people work like that. Not quickly. People can always work quickly, willingly, when a person feels they won't be cheated. Kyle had one answer. This is the road. Not just the one they're building. The blow came from where no one expected it, but no one expected it so quickly. Morden worked through intermediaries. The chain was neatly constructed. The right to a crossing point on the Duchy's eastern border was quietly transferred to a new owner. The old ferryman, who had run the crossing for 30 years, received a handsome sum and retired. The new owner tripled the fare, effective immediately. On the surface, it seemed like legitimate commerce. In reality, it was a strangulation. The crossing was the only one for 30 kilometers. The river was wide and deep. They didn't build a bridge. The ferry was enough. Trade convoys, which had begun regularly using the restored Asterholm Road, were met with the new tariff and ground to a halt. Triple the crossing price was killing any profits. The merchants counted and recounted. Most of them turned around. The young market by the castle gates, the one that had barely begun to gain momentum, died down. The stalls were standing, but there were no customers. Alice walked around the market for 20 minutes and returned with one word: empty. Kyle didn't say anything about it for 3 days. This was unusual. Everyone who knew him, Gaston, Alice, Duncan, waited for a reaction, a counterattack, negotiations, at least an order to clarify the details. Nothing. Kyle ate, worked, went to the construction site, read, sleeped. Alice tried to broach the subject on the second day. He listened and then changed the subject. 3 days of silence. It wasn't a trial for Kyle. It was for everyone else. She found herself fearing not the problem itself, but the fact that it might be insoluble. That Kyle was silent not because he was thinking, but because he couldn't see a way out. Duncan, when she shared this thought, simply shook his head. He said briefly, if he hadn't seen it, he'd be worried. Just like we worry. Gaston, on the third evening, said the situation wouldn't improve on its own. Kyle nodded and went to bed. On the fourth morning, he rose earlier than usual, saddled his horse, and rode east. Alice caught up with him at the gate. She'd already gotten used to the fact that when he went somewhere without explanation, she just had to follow. Duncan watched them go and then went to his men. They rode in silence. The road ran along the floodplain. The first shoots of green were green to the right, and the forest trunks gleamed black in the distance to the left. Then the river appeared, first with a sound, then with a glimmer. Kyle stopped at the wide space where the ferry was moored. The ferryman, the new one sent by Morden, saw them from afar. He didn't get out. He remained on the pier, watching. Kyle surveyed the crossing, both banks, the width of the river. He said nothing and rode south along the bank. Alice followed beside him, silent. It took effort. They rode along the water for 20 minutes, then 30. The shore gradually became rockier, the forest denser. Then the river narrowed. Not abruptly, but gradually, but noticeably. 2 spurs of the bank jutted out toward each other, squeezing the riverbed. The current was faster and louder here. Kyle stopped his horse. He looked from one bank to the other for a long time. 40 meters. Maybe 45. The rocky shores provide good footing. The current is strong, but the water is shallower than where the ferry is. He dismounted. He walked to the edge of the bank. He sat down. He looked at the water, at its flow, at the rocks beneath the surface, at the shadows cast by the trees on the opposite bank. Then he stood up and uttered one word. Bridge. Alice looked at the river, then at him. She said what was true. There was no money for a bridge. Kyle turned to her. There's a forest. A pause. Alice looked at the river again. Now it's not the same as looking at an obstacle, but as looking at a task that they are beginning to understand. A wooden bridge isn't steel or stone. It's logs, piles, and decking. The northern oak stands in the forest for thousands of hectares. She mentally continued the chain. The bridge, her own crossing, not someone else's. The bridge. Merchants don't pay Morden, they pay into the Asterholm treasury. The bridge, Morden's ferry, is becoming useless. A ferry without traffic is a waste. It all came together in a matter of seconds, and the further she counted, the clearer the picture became. She nodded. Slowly at first, then faster. Before heading back, Kyle walked along the shore again, slowly. He looked at the rocks, at the corner where the river entered the narrows, at the trees that could be cut down for supports right here, without having to haul them from far away. Alice walked alongside, already counting out loud. How many logs? How many piles? How many people? How much time? Kyle listened and nodded occasionally. Morden's ferryman saw them from the other bank. He stood and watched them walk along the shore and discuss something. He didn't understand what exactly they were watching. He had to understand. Kyle was already looking at the shore, not the river, but the rocks, figuring out where to place the supports. The forest supplied the timber for the bridge before Haas could even request another shipment. Kyle gave the order the morning after his trip to the river. The best trunks, long, straight, without a single knot along their entire length, are set aside, not counted toward the ship's contract, in a separate plot under guard. Alice did the calculations in a day. How many logs were needed for a 45-meter span? How many for piles? How many for the flooring? Duncan took over security at the construction site without any fuss. He simply assigned 4 men to work shifts and slept nearby for the first 2 weeks. The work began with the water. The first piles had to be driven into the riverbed, and this proved to be the hardest part. The current in the Narrows was stronger than it appeared from the shore. People worked in pairs. One held, the other kicked. The water was cold, spring cold coming from the mountains, up to mid-thigh. After an hour, my legs became numb. Shifts changed every 40 minutes, then every 30. The piles moved slowly. 1 pile took half a day. 17 were needed. On the 5th day, the first strangers appeared. 2 of them. They introduced themselves as sales agents and wanted to inspect the work. Duncan came out to meet them personally, unarmed, in ordinary clothes, completely calmly, and explained that the construction was taking place on the territory of the Duchy and there were no outsiders here. He turned them both around and escorted them to the edge of the ducal lands. They left in silence. On the 9th day, the sawmill burned. It was small and temporary, built specifically for the bridge. Duncan and 2 others made it before the fire reached the prepared logs. 2 were caught right there, wet and with the smell of resin on their clothes. Duncan didn't beat them or arrest them. He simply looked at them both with that look that, in someone with his experience, speaks louder than words, and let them go. They never returned. The construction continued. The narrator won't describe each day. The days were similar. But there are a few images that linger. First, a man up to his chest in icy water, holding a log vertically with both hands while the other hits it from above with a heavy sledgehammer, and again, and again, and again, until the pile goes deep enough into the bottom. This takes all day. The next day, another pile. The second, the night shift by torchlight. The torches burn unevenly in the wind from the river. Shadows dance across the deck. Hammers hammer in the darkness. Somewhere beyond the river, dogs are barking, either at Duncan's men or just because. They keep barking. Third, morning when the last plank has been nailed down and the bridge stands, and no one has yet taken a step across it, just standing there, above the water. There's no point in telling you about each day. They were all alike. The cold, the water, the heavy logs, the fatigue, which by the end of the first week had ceased to be acute and had become simply a background phenomenon. But there are moments you can see even if you weren't there. The first span beam lay across the river on the 22nd day. He simply lay there, pulled from both banks simultaneously, by ropes, 8 pairs of hands on each side. When the end of the beam touched the support on the opposite bank, someone let out a short breath. Not a shout, not applause, just a sigh. But everyone heard it. The flooring had been laid by torchlight for the last 3 nights, 2 days behind schedule and catching up. The last plank was nailed to the bridge at dawn. There was no opening ceremony. There were no flags, speeches, or ribbon cutting. The bridge was simply completed, and the convoy stood at its base. 4 carts, a middling merchant from an eastern city, who spent 4 days at a closed crossing and managed to spend more waiting than he expected to spend on the entire journey. He rode onto the platform first. The horse moved slowly, the unfamiliar surface, the new sounds beneath its hooves. The merchant looked straight ahead, not down. The cart creaked on its planks. No one stopped, no one demanded anything. Only Kyle stood at the entrance and watched. The merchant passed by. He didn't thank them. He didn't nod. He simply rode on toward the market. 3 more convoys waiting by the shore immediately followed him. The ferryman, the one Morden had posted, watched it all from his shore. The ferry was moored at the pier. The wind rippled the water. People who had previously stood in line now walked past the bridge without even looking. 3 days later, the ferry was burned. Morden gave the order himself, not through intermediaries, but directly. He didn't hold on to things that weren't worth anything. The burnt-out piles stuck out of the water for several more weeks, a silent, ugly reminder of what happens when you put something in the wrong position. The bridge remained. It wasn't just a path across the river. It was infrastructure. Its own, not someone else's. The stones in the supports came from the Asterholm forest. The decking logs are from the northern forest. The labor is the work of the Duchy's people. Not a single one of Morden's men, not a single agent of Velen had anything to do with this bridge. And as long as it stands, so does Asterholm. The ferry's burnt-out pilings remained in the water for 3 more weeks. No one removed them. Then they too disappeared. The current had done its work. All that remained was the spot where they had been. Duncan walked around it every morning like someone walks around a fortress wall after it's built. Checking, feeling, making sure, not because he didn't trust the work, simply because it now had to be protected. The merchants crossed the bridge and immediately discovered the next flaw. There was nowhere to trade. The small market by the castle gates, a dozen stalls that had sprung up naturally in recent months, couldn't accommodate even a fifth of those who now passed through Asterholm. A merchant's caravan isn't just one man with a basket. It's also a collection of carts laden with goods, a need for storage at least overnight, and the need to buy fodder, provisions, and repairs. And the desire to sell some of what you're carrying right here, because there are people here too, and there's demand here too. Without a proper market, Asterholm was just a corridor. People passed through without stopping. The money passed right by. Kyle announced the market's opening on the first Friday after the 50th convoy had crossed the bridge. He chose the right location, a large square in front of the old warehouses, empty, trampled, with awnings that were still standing. Repairing the awnings cost little. Marking the counters cost even less. A board was installed at the entrance. On the board were the rules, written large, legible, in 2 languages. The rules were simple. The counter fee was fixed, paid once a day, the amount was written on the board, and it didn't change. There were no additional fees, no wardens who need to be paid separately for the right to trade undisturbed, no voluntary contributions for people with guns. Disputes between merchants were referred to the market judge, whom Dora became. Decisions were swift and final. It sounds simple. In reality, it was revolutionary. Dora proved so natural as a market judge that after 2 weeks, it seemed as if she'd always been one. There were few incidents, a couple of disputes over the weight of an item, one conflict over a place. Dora resolved them briefly, reasonably, and without favoritism. Not once did anyone in a dispute leave her feeling unfairly treated. This in itself was a rarity. Merchants began to know her by name. This was a good sign. In most markets in this region, the system worked differently. The official fee is small, but then they come to you. A security guard who keeps order. A collector from a more serious gentleman. Someone's nephew who doesn't explain anything, just stands and waits for you to give him a coin. By the end of the day, the actual price of the trade was 3 times higher than the stated price. Everyone knew it. Everyone paid, because that's how it is everywhere. It wasn't like that in Asterholm. The first traders tested this with distrust. They paid, traded all day, and waited for more to come. None came. The following week, they came back and told their neighbors about it. Rumors of this kind spread quickly in the commercial world, where a fair deal is rare. By the end of the first month, the market had over 60 stalls. The space couldn't cope. Kyle expanded it into a vacant lot behind the warehouses, which was immediately occupied. Market revenues have trickled into the treasury in a thin but steady stream. Not a flood yet, but something we can count on, and count on. That's when Velen made a mistake. He imposed a transit ban. Any merchant passing through Asterholm lost the right to use the roads of the Duchy of Velen. The logic was simple. Force the merchants to choose. Either Asterholm or access to the richer Velen lands. The effect was counterproductive. Merchants, already outraged by the extortion at the Velen outposts, took the ban as the final straw. 2 trading houses filed complaints with the Royal Trade Council. One major transit carrier publicly announced it was permanently changing its route. Several Velen merchants who traded through Asterholm found themselves in a situation where their own duke was restricting their income, and they made no secret of it. Velen tried to turn off the tap. He only redirected the water. Velen didn't immediately understand what had happened. At first, he thought the pressure was working. A few small traders actually preferred his route, fearing they would lose access to his markets. But they were small, and the reaction of the larger ones was different. One carrier, a large one with 50 trailers and contracts 3 years in advance, wrote an open letter to Velen. Not a complaint, not a request. A letter explaining the math. 3 days of extra travel times 50 horses times 300 trips per year. Velen was losing more than Asterholm. The letter reached court before Velen had time to respond. Kyle read the report that evening at Asterholm Castle. He said nothing. He put the paper in a pile. He ordered Alice to record all the merchants who had switched from the Velen route. Names, goods, volumes. These were future regulars. Kyle would check the market every few days, just walk by, look, count. Not the stalls, the faces. Did the same people return? Did new ones arrive? You could read the market more accurately from faces than from any numbers in any book. That evening, for the first time in a long time, Gaston pulled out an old bottle of wine he'd been saving for who knows when. He poured 2 glasses. He placed one in front of Kyle. He looked. He took it. He drank it silently. The drainage work took 4 months. Peter personally supervised every day. He knew the mine as well as his own body, and there was no need for a new engineer. 16 workers were hired. 8 to drain the water from the outside, 8 to clear the entrance tunnel. The new drainage channel was constructed with care, not using wooden formwork as before, but stone. The work was carried out in mud, darkness, and cold. The dungeon knows no seasons. It's always the same temperature, and the summer heat outside was irrelevant. People would emerge soaking wet, warm themselves by the fire, and then head back down. Peter was the first down and the last out every day. Kyle came once a week. He'd look at the water level mark on the wall by the entrance. He'd nod. He'd leave. That was enough. The canal opened in mid-autumn. It wasn't a big ceremony. They simply removed the last temporary dam and the water began to flow. First, a thin trickle along a new chute, then more fully, then a steady, forceful stream that found its way and went where it was directed. Peter stood nearby and looked at the water the way one looks at something one has long disbelieved. The mine began to dry up. This too was slow. Not days, but weeks. The level dropped a palm a day, sometimes less. Peter kept marks on a pole at the entrance. Every morning a new line, slightly lower than yesterday's. Every time Kyle arrived, he'd look at the pole first, then at Peter. Then he'd nod and go look at the rest. On the 42nd day, Peter announced that the level had dropped enough to descend. The first tier was open. Kyle said he would go himself. Peter said no. Him first. The mine is his business. If there's something wrong with the air or the supports, he'll be the first to know. Kyle looked at him for a second, then agreed. Peter descended with 2 lanterns and a rope secured above. He was underground for 3 hours. Above, they waited in silence. Alice counted the time. Duncan stood at the entrance, looking like someone who wasn't nervous, just very attentive. Kyle sat on a rock a little to the side, looking toward the forest. When the rope tightened, the signal that they were ascending, everyone came forward. Peter slowly emerged from the tunnel. He stood up. He looked at Kyle. He was white. Alice later said she remembered that expression on his face for a long time. Not what it had been before the descent, and not what happened after Kyle picked up the stone and nodded. That very moment, when Peter had just come out and stood there, still without saying a word. His face was blank, but something enormous was just beginning to fit inside it. She immediately realized this wasn't found something pretty good. This was on a different scale, not from fear or the cold. That special whiteness that comes over a person when they see something so far beyond what they expected, that his brain didn't have time to process it and his face remained blank. Like a piece of paper that had just had everything written on it erased. Kyle didn't ask anything. He stood up. He walked over. Peter opened his hand. A stone lay in it. Dark, dense, heavier than a piece of waste rock of that size should be. The veins in it were gray with a slight metallic sheen. Not gold, not copper. Those in the know will recognize it by its weight, by the color of the vein, by how it lies in the rock. It's a silver-bearing layer, the very one marked on the old map, on the lower tier, where the old galleries didn't reach. Kyle picked up the stone and turned it over in his hands. He looked at the vein at the break. He put it in his pocket, unhurriedly, like one might put an ordinary roadstone, picked up out of curiosity. Then he took Peter aside a bit and said quietly, 5 gold pieces a month on top of his pay. For knowing and keeping quiet. Not a favor, work. Peter nodded without hesitation. Kyle gave the others one simple message. The drainage is holding, the air is normal. We're hiring more people starting Monday and we'll begin clearing the first tier. Everyone left. The day seemed like any other workday. No one talked about anything at the construction site until evening. Work continued as usual, clearing the entrance, reinforcing the ceiling in the first tunnel, standard tasks. Only the atmosphere was slightly different. That drawn-out, electrified silence that happens when everyone feels something, but no one says it out loud. Kyle left the mine in the middle of the day. Peter watched him go and returned to work. But at the entrance to the mine stood one young worker. Mikas, 18 years old, hired 2 weeks ago for menial work. He didn't hear the conversation. He was too far away. But he saw Peter rise from the shaft. He saw his face, saw Kyle take something from his hand and put it away, saw them step aside and talk quietly. Words weren't needed to understand that something important had happened. Mikas came home that evening. His wife was having dinner. He told her, in a low voice, almost a whisper, because he felt he couldn't speak about it out loud, that they seemed to have found something serious in the mine. His wife nodded. The next morning, she told her neighbor. The word seems didn't escape Mikas's notice. By lunchtime the next day, it had already disappeared along the road. It simply remained as something big was found in the mine. Asterholm was a small place. News travels fast in small places. They arrived on Tuesday. 2 of them, mounted on good horses with a single servant in tow. Well-dressed, with that special urban polish that distinguishes people accustomed to long tables in fine offices. They introduced themselves as textile merchants and said they were interested in routes across the new Asterholm Bridge. Alice had been watching them from the market gates from the very first moment. Something was wrong. The textile merchants looked at their stalls, at their customers, at the roads. These ones were looking north, towards where the trees darkened beyond the field, near the mine hill. She made inquiries through 2 acquaintances in town. 2 hours later, she had the names. The Silver Bank emerged 120 years ago from a small money-changing house in the capital, and since then has not made a single large bet that has not paid off. He had a rule, known to everyone who worked with him. The bank never enters into a deal out of politeness. If Silver Bank agents arrived somewhere in person, it meant that a preliminary calculation had already been made, and they were happy with the result. Their calculations regarding Asterholm were obviously very pleasing. They hadn't come to haggle. They had come to close a deal they already considered a done deal. Kyle accepted them exactly as such, as people who already considered the case closed. That was the first thing he showed them, that he saw it, and that it didn't bother him. The Silver Bank, the kingdom's largest financial house, with 3 branches in the capital and correspondents in 5 neighboring states. He didn't send agents to scout the fabric markets of small provincial duchies. He sent agents where he sensed big money. Word of the mine spread further and faster than Kyle had expected. He received them at the castle, calmly, without a hint of surprise, as if he'd been expecting these 2 specifically that day. They laid out the proposal in full, without rushing, with the careful wording of people who hold such meetings often. The gist: the Silver Bank is paying off Asterholm's entire debt, immediately, in full, including Morden's debt, a full 70%. In exchange, he gets 40% of the mine. No management rights, just a financial stake. Kyle retains control, retains everything else, and as of tomorrow morning, he has no creditors. It was generous, almost suspiciously generous. Kyle listened without interrupting until the last word. Then he looked out the window for a few seconds. The agents waited. 40% of a silver mine isn't a revenue stream. It's a generational asset. It's leverage that will translate into influence in 10 years and control in 20. The Silver Bank didn't make altruistic deals. If it gave money now, it would get 100 times more later, and it knew it, and it assumed Kyle didn't understand it. Kyle understood. He declined the share, briefly, without explanation, and immediately offered something else. A loan secured by the first year of production. Not a share, not a partnership. A pure loan on market terms, secured by specific deliveries at specific times. The agents exchanged glances. This was a different deal. Worse for the bank from a long-term perspective. No ownership, no stake in the growth. But it was better from a risk standpoint. The collateral was real, the terms were defined, and there were no management headaches. The professional part of their brains said, "This makes sense." The strategic unit said, "We're here for something else." The senior agent asked for time until morning. Kyle said, "Until morning." They left. In the hallway, Alice heard it through the open window. The senior agent was speaking quietly but clearly. He wanted to know who was behind this man. Which advisor? Which school? Because what happened inside didn't seem like a decision made by someone without experience. The younger one replied that by all indications, there were no advisors. A pause. Then the senior. "It's worse then." As they parted, already at the door, the senior agent said one thing. The Silver Bank rarely encounters people who, in a situation like this, refuse the easy way out. He didn't ask why. He simply stated it. Like a man who has realized something important and is in no hurry to say it out loud. Kyle replied that easy exits rarely lead to the right place. The agent nodded and left. Outside, he told his assistant, quietly, so that the servant waiting by the horses wouldn't hear, that in 2 years he would personally come to Asterholm again. And this time they'll reach an agreement. He's sure of it. The assistant asked, "What if they don't?" The senior agent thought for a second. He replied, "That'll be the most interesting thing." In the morning, the agents returned with a response. The bank accepted the loan terms. The collateral was for the first year of production, the market rate, and the term was 3 years. The agreement was drawn up by evening. Alice, who read it paragraph by paragraph, couldn't find a single clause that gave the bank anything other than a guaranteed return of the money. It was unusual. She mentioned it to Kyle. He replied, "They did it because they were counting on the next deal." This was their investment in the relationship, not in paperwork. Alice understood, and added another point to her own list. Conduct the next transaction with the bank with her eyes open too. Morden learned of the Silver Bank agent's visit the day after they left. He had ears in the right places. He always had, and what he heard changed his mind immediately. The mine was real. The boy now had an asset that made him immune to ordinary debt pressure. If the bank gives him a loan, the debt will be settled, and Morden will be out of the game entirely. Every day of delay is a step further away from Kyle's position, where he could be crushed. Morden acted the next morning. Convening a creditor's council was a formality, everything according to the law. The basis, Article 14 of the Trade and Credit Code. The debtor created new financial obligations, loan negotiations with a third party, without notifying senior creditors. This is considered actions threatening solvency. A senior creditor owning more than half of the total debt has the right to demand immediate full repayment. 30 days. Article 14 was genuine. Alice found it in the code in half an hour. The wording was written the way laws are written, intended to be used by intelligent people at the right moment, specific enough to be applied, broad enough to be interpreted. Morden's interpretation was aggressive but not impossible. She rewrote the article 3 times, with different emphases, looking for a loophole. There were no loopholes. The law was written by people who thought ahead. Alice put the papers down. She looked at the ceiling. She thought. So, instead of looking for a loophole, she needed to cut the ground out from under the demand itself. That was a different task. The entire sum, with interest, down to the last coin. The notification arrived in Asterholm the next day, official, sealed, delivered by royal courier. Alice read it 3 times. Then she laid out on the table all the debt accounts she had been keeping for the past months and sat over them until midnight. The numbers didn't add up. No matter what the scenario, no matter what the assumptions, they didn't add up. 30 days was a deliberately impossible deadline. It wasn't an ultimatum with conditions. It was an axe. Duncan spent the last few days cleaning his sword. Not because he intended to use it, he simply needed his hands to do something. He always did this when the situation was beyond his control, and all he could do was wait. Gaston walked through the castle quietly, as one might in a house where someone is ill. Kyle said one word on the first evening after receiving the notice. Nothing. It wasn't "everything's fine" or "don't worry." It was, he heard, and that's all for now. On the second day, he asked Gaston if the library had a map of the kingdom's trade routes. Gaston found one. It was old, about 20 years old, the corners frayed but legible. Kyle laid it out on the large table. He looked at it for a long time. Not the way one looks when studying, but the way one looks when one sees what one was looking for and checks it again. The finger followed one route, then another. It stopped at a point where several roads converged into one. Gaston watched from the doorway. He wasn't looking at the map, but at Kyle. And he thought, 3 years ago, Asterholm was barely on this map. It's there now. A bridge, a road, a market, a name now known to trading houses in 4 cities. Kyle was looking at the map, and Gaston finally allowed himself to move closer. He glanced over his shoulder. He saw Kyle's finger at the intersection of 4 roads in the capital. Then he moved to the trading port on the west coast, then to the mining region in the east. Then he returned to Asterholm. Gaston didn't understand the logic. But he'd long since stopped demanding that he immediately understand Kyle's logic. It was enough to observe, and sooner or later, everything would fall into place. Kyle folded the map and placed it on the table next to Morden's notice. 2 sheets of paper, an ultimatum and a map. He looked at both. Then he took the map. He left the notice lying there. That night, no one in the castle slept well. Alice didn't turn off the light until 3. Duncan was sitting on the steps by the entrance, in armor, for no apparent reason. Gaston went over in his mind all the people in his 40 years of service who had found their way out of impossible situations, and he thought that there were only a few of them, and that they all did the same thing. They found not a way out of a hole, but another hole, which the first hole did not reach. Kyle was asleep. That in itself seemed impossible, and that's precisely why it was the most important signal of all. In the morning, Kyle briefly explained the task to Alice. 12 recipients, each with a specific proposal, which he had sketched out on a separate sheet of paper. No prior arrangements, no protocol. He's coming himself without intermediaries. 3 days. Alice looked at the list, then at him. She said, "It's impossible in 3 days." Kyle put on his traveling coat. He replied, "We'll see." The next morning, he showed up at Alice's office door and said he was going to the capital. Alone. She was to prepare the paperwork for the meetings he'd leave on his desk. Alice looked at the list. 12 names. Shipbuilders, trading houses, 1 duke, 2 bankers. People with whom, under normal circumstances, it would be difficult to come to an agreement quickly. Lengthy negotiations, intermediaries, protocol. Kyle was already leaving. Alice asked him after him. "How long?" 3 days, he replied without turning around. He rode out alone. No retinue, no guards, no heraldic badges on his clothing. An ordinary horseman on the road. There are hundreds of them every day. Morden couldn't have received a warning he didn't have. In the capital, he stayed at a modest inn in the commercial district. Central, good location, no ducal pomp. I scheduled my first meeting for the next morning. Haas was first. Kyle didn't come to sell timber. He came to offer a 5-year contract for exclusive supply of Asterholm oak with a down payment of 1/3 of the contract price immediately. In exchange for this, they received a 5% discount off the market price for the entire term. Haas received a guarantee of delivery in a situation where good ship timber was in short supply and paid for this guarantee in advance. He thought for 2 hours, quick by Haas's standards, and signed. The second meeting was with a furniture house that supplies 3 royal residences, exclusive rights to Asterholm oak for non-marine uses. Same structure, current down payment, multi-year contract, fixed price. The third was a major freighter who ran trains along the northern route and cursed every crossing along the way. Kyle offered him priority passage across the Asterholm Bridge for 5 years. Always first in line, guaranteed processing time, fixed rate. The carrier didn't even haggle. Delays on crossings cost them more than the privilege was worth. Then it all happened quickly. A grain merchant with the northern routes who needed stable tolls. A banker who wanted to be first in line for a mine loan when production began. A duke from the eastern lands who needed building materials for 2 years in advance. A textile trading house, for whom the route through Asterholm shortened the journey by 4 days. 12 meetings in 3 days. Kyle never overpromised. He didn't paint the future. Only what exists right now. The bridge that stands, the road that works, the forest that's being cut down. Specific, verifiable, for every promise, a document. For every document, money up front. The people he spoke to were accustomed to lengthy negotiations, to protocol, to intermediaries, to 3 meetings before the first handshake. Kyle stripped away all the unnecessary elements and left only one. Value and price, pure exchange, no drama. On the 4th morning, he left the capital. In his saddlebag was a letter of credit secured by the sum Alice hadn't been able to raise in 30 days in Asterholm. Kyle collected it in 3. The creditors' council met on the 28th day of 30. Morden arrived first. He took a seat at the head of the table. Beside him stood 2 lawyers, folders of documents, and a prepared speech about the breach of the terms and the inevitable consequences. The remaining creditors sat down on the sides. They were there as a formality, as an audience that had to bear witness. The venue was well chosen. High ceiling, cool lighting, heavy chairs. Everything spoke of inevitability. Kyle walked in alone. No lawyers, no advisors, no security, no folders. In his hands, 3 documents folded together. He walked up to the table. He laid down the first document, then the second, then the third. Each one separately, without rushing, with a pause between them. Payment orders confirmed by the Silver Bank for the full amount of all debt obligations of the Duchy of Asterholm. Every creditor, every interest, every day of delay that never happened because the 30th day hasn't arrived yet. He didn't say a word. The room was silent. Morden looked at the documents. The lawyer on the left began leafing through the folder automatically, looking for a counterargument that had to exist, because it couldn't be that simple. The other creditors exchanged glances. Morden took the first document. Read it, take the second. The face did not change. He had a good face for this, smooth and impenetrable, developed over the years, but his fingers held the paper a little tighter than necessary. The debt was closed. Completely. Legally. 2 days before the deadline. Nothing to say, nothing to dispute, nothing to demand. Morden looked up. He looked at Kyle for a long time, a really long time, with that assessing look you give to an opponent you've underestimated. Then he asked a question, quietly, almost secularly. From where in 30 days? Kyle looked at him. He answered, from the same place as everyone else in Asterholm. From work. Then he took his copies of the receipts. He turned around and left. When he left the hall, the corridor was silent. Only his steps on the stone floor, even unhurried. No triumph, no relief in his eyes. Just a man who has completed the next task on his list and is moving on to the next. Behind the closed door in the courtroom, Morden sat over 3 documents for a long time. The lawyer was saying something to him. He wasn't listening. He was thinking about that very map of trade routes, the one his informant had seen spread out on the table in Asterholm 3 weeks ago, and about what was marked on it, and about the fact that the boy saw something he himself hadn't. This was more unpleasant than any defeat. Kyle returned from the capital the same way he'd left, alone, unannounced. The debt was settled. This fact now existed in the papers and in the minds of everyone who should have known it. But if anyone thought that the debt would be closed and the fight would be over, they had a poor understanding of who they were dealing with. Morden spent the next 3 weeks in the capital. Not on financial matters, other matters, lunches with important people, conversations in clubs that formerly existed for playing cards, but in fact for the quiet exchange of influence. His message was never stated directly. That would have been a mistake. It came across as a concern. Too rapid growth in the provincial duchy, banking ties with foreign houses, unconventional trading mechanisms. Someone will definitely find something amiss. Someone will definitely decide to look into this. Courtiers love such conversations. Concern doesn't commit you to anything, but it does open up opportunities. Prince Raymond heard about Asterholm 3 times in 1 month. From Morden's man, from a report from the Trade Council, and in a private conversation with an advisor who worked for several employers at once. 3 sources, 3 different angles, and 1 name at the center of each. Raymond was one of those people you shouldn't underestimate precisely because he doesn't seem dangerous at first glance. Friendly, educated, a good listener. All of this was genuine, not feigned. But underneath it all lay something else. A keen interest in who gains power and how. He treated everything that grew quickly the same way. First he observed it, then he decided how this growth could be used or how it should be stopped. Asterholm's place on his list was still uncertain. Time would tell which column he would end up in. The prince was 26, second in line of succession, with the character of a man who long ago stopped counting on the throne by right and began accumulating influence by calculation. Sharp, patient, able to wait. He took a piece of paper and wrote 1 word on it. Asterholm. He put it in a folder marked Surveillance. The folder was thick. That same month, while the court was still whispering, a family arrived in Asterholm. 5 of them. A man of about 40 named Rhine, his wife, and 3 grown sons. All blacksmiths. The father taught his sons from childhood. All knew how to work with metal from rough forging to fine fittings. Their city was burned 3 years ago in a skirmish between 2 neighboring barons who did not care that people lived between them. The blacksmith shop burned down, along with its tools and supplies. Since then, the family has struggled to eke out a living, working on contracts here, repairs there, and staying overnight with strangers. One of the merchants who regularly passed through the Asterholm Bridge told them about the conditions the Duke had given the settlers. Rain didn't believe it at first. He asked again. The merchant repeated the same thing. They arrived on Wednesday. They waited in the courtyard for Kyle to come out, looking like people bracing themselves for the news. The terms have changed. There are hidden obligations. This is how it really works. Kyle came out, listened, and offered. A plot of land by the river, good water for the forge. Tools from the castle's stockpile, not new, but functional. 3 full years free of any taxes or duties. And the first contract is now open. Hardware and fasteners for bridge and road construction, fair pricing, payment upon completion. Rain was silent for a second. Then he asked where to sign. Rhine the blacksmith turned out to be a silent man, as befits people of his profession. They are accustomed to the fact that words are superfluous where there is fire and metal. But in the first 2 weeks, he walked around Asterholm, leisurely, with a professional eye. He looked at the bridge. Additional braces were needed under the deck. He looked at the castle gates. The hinges were good, but the bolt was poorly made. He looked at the forge, which belonged to the duchy, small, neglected, with a cracked furnace. In the 3rd week, he presented Gaston with a list of what could be repaired and improved in Asterholm with the help of a single forge. The list filled 2 pages. Gaston read it. Then he told Kyle only one thing. He was wrong about the tools. Gaston approached Kyle that evening with a stack of calculations in his hands and quietly laid out the arithmetic. The cost of the tools, the value of the land, 3 years of lost taxes. The sum was substantial. He didn't object. He was simply stating the facts, as always. Kyle took the paper. He looked at it. He placed another piece of paper next to it. His own, written while Gaston was calculating. It contained a calculation. The cost of purchasing forged items from outside suppliers for 3 years in advance, along with the cost of delivery. The cost of construction downtime due to a shortage of fasteners, and the cost of losses from low-quality metal sent by those who didn't value their reputation. One blacksmith shop in Asterholm filled all these positions simultaneously. After 3 years, it began paying taxes. After 5, it began training local apprentices. Gaston looked at both sheets of paper for a long time. Then he put his away. He picked up a clean sheet. He wrote something, not for Kyle, but for himself. It was a pattern Kyle had consciously cultivated, though he never called it that out loud. Every family that came to Asterholm received something concrete now and gave something concrete later, not through obligation, but through interest. Rain wasn't obligated to repair the bridge. He wanted to, because he lived here, because this was his place, because he understood metal and saw what needed to be done. People work differently when they're protecting their own rather than working to take over someone else's. The principle became clear. In her 3rd year at Asterholm, Alice got a desk. Not just a paper surface, a proper work desk, complete with drawers and an inkstand, with space for mail in separate stacks. She placed it by the window overlooking the market so she could see the activity below without leaving. She used to be that movement downstairs, with the rag counter, with the remnants of her father's wares. Sometimes in the mornings, while the candle was warming, she thought about it, not sentimentally. She was simply marking the distance. Asterholm had become a different place in 2 years. Not what it had been, but also not what she saw on the first day. The market below. Over 60 stalls. On Fridays, there's not enough space. The bridge over the river. From the eastern road, you can hear it before you see it. The clatter of wheels on the deck. The road holds up even in the autumn mud. Families of workers began settling in the forest near the mine hill. A few houses, then a dozen, then a street began to form. Alice saw all this. She also saw what others didn't, because she kept the books. The columns of numbers that had been pointing in different directions a year ago gradually began to converge. Not yet a victory, not yet enough, but the direction was clear and stable. One day, during negotiations with a major grain trading house, she realized something important. Already in the middle of the conversation, listening to her partner outline his conditions, she knew what he would say next. Not because she guessed, but because she saw the logic before he voiced it, and she knew she would answer herself. The negotiations ended quickly and well. On the way back, she stopped at the bridge and stood for a long time, looking out over the water. She thought like Kyle. Not because she copied him, but because she'd spent 2 years observing how he worked, and something inside her had shifted. Her father taught her to be careful, to avoid attracting attention, to work within the boundaries of what could be protected. A good teacher, good lessons. But he didn't see what happens when you stop defending yourself and start building. Her father died without seeing it. A week before the end, he lay in bed and told her, she held his hand, that trade on a large scale always ends the same way. Someone stronger comes along and takes it. He didn't want to scare her. He wanted to prepare her. He was wrong, but he didn't know that. His name was Anton Marsh. He spent 30 years in trade, first as an apprentice to his uncle, then on his own, gradually building routes, a reputation, and connections. An honest merchant in a world where honesty was more strategy than principle. He simply understood before many that a reputation is worth more than a single good deal. He was known. He was trusted. Asterholm killed him, not immediately, but slowly. When the Duchy began to crumble, he lost his routes, his warehouses, his partners. For 3 years, he paid off what he'd lost by selling what was left. By the end, there was nothing left. Only debts, paid down to the last coin, and a daughter, to whom he passed on not property, but something else. The ability to count, the ability to read people, and the awkward habit of always calling a spade a spade. Alice thought about it without bitterness. She simply kept it in her mind. The way one keeps something important, something that can no longer be changed, but can be remembered. Late in the fall, after one of those long days of negotiations from dawn until dark, she went out into the courtyard for some fresh air. Kyle was sitting by the small fire Gaston had lit against the cold. alone, holding a mug he didn't drink from. Alice sat down next to him. They were silent for a long time. The fire was small and steady. There were stars in the sky. They were clearly visible in Asterholm because the light here was still weak. She said one thing to him. No question. What he never says is whether it's worth it all. Kyle stared into the fire. Then he answered, yes. Just yes. Without explanation, without qualification. As they say about something about which there is no doubt. Alice looked at him. She thought about the first day, about the market, about how she laughed and then stopped. She saw then the difference between a person who believes and a person who knows. Now this man sat by the fire and looked like any other tired person at the end of a difficult year. His shoulders were slightly slumped. His eyes weren't as sharp as usual, but calm, a weariness he didn't hide, because there was no point in hiding it here. Alice looked at him and thought, in 2 years, he hadn't once said, I'm having a hard time. Not Gaston, not Duncan, not her. It wasn't pretense or stoicism on principle. He simply was designed so that internal states come out through action, not words. Fatigue isn't a complaint, it's a signal. A signal that he needed to sit by the fire for a while. So he did. This habit, of speaking with actions, not words, was perhaps the first thing she'd picked up from him. It was the first time he'd allowed himself to simply sit. Then footsteps. Duncan appeared at the fire with a look they both knew by now. No problem, no urgency. Information. On the eastern border, patrols spotted a small detachment. 10 men, dressed in Velen livery without any military formation. They were moving cautiously, keeping close to the trees. Not an army. A reconnaissance force. He added, there were 6 of them, professionals. Duncan set out before dawn, with 4 men, without torches. He didn't find the scouts right away. They were professional, moving regularly, keeping time. But professional scouts know the terrain they are exploring, and Duncan had known this land for 20 years and remembered every lowland, every clearing, every stream where it would be convenient to stop for the night. He wasn't pursuing. He simply got there first. When the 6 Velen scouts entered the clearing by the old oak tree, a small fire was already burning. A single man sat nearby, unarmed, non-aggressive, frying a piece of bread and lard on a stick. The 4 of them stood silently around the perimeter of the clearing, in the shade of the trees. There were several exits, but they were all visible. Duncan gestured toward the fire, as if to say, sit down. The scout commander, a large, experienced man with a scar on his chin, assessed the situation in a matter of seconds. They weren't trapped. They could have escaped, even with losses. But there's no point. There's no one left to hide from. They've been seen and know who sent them. Further secrecy is just a waste of time and good food. He sat down. The others sat down after them. Duncan divided the bread equally. No one spoke for the first 5 minutes. They simply ate and warmed themselves. Then Duncan began the conversation as simply as one begins it with a person one has known for a long time. Without preamble, without threats, without protocol. Both know who sent whom. Both know why. It's just a matter of details. Details are more interesting than empty silence. Duncan had used this method, treating instead of interrogating more than once. Over 20 years of military service, he'd learned one thing. Fear makes people lie because they fear the consequences of telling the truth. Satiety and calm alleviate this fear. A person who has been given food and not threatened usually tells the truth, simply because it's easier than making things up. The reconnaissance commander turned out to be a straightforward man. He told what he knew, not because he was afraid, but because the situation had already developed in such a way that there was no point in hiding it. And talking to a smart opponent is always more pleasant than remaining silent. Velen worked for 3 months. 3 small baronies on the northern border, Erden, Pollak, and Lesser Krasti. Small, poor, and tied to a few large landowners through debt and trade, Velen proposed a coalition. A joint petition to the crown to establish a regency over Asterholm. The basis was the article on territorial instability. If 3 neighboring rulers signed simultaneously, the crown was obliged to consider it. Regency meant that governance would pass to a royal appointee, the one Morden had discussed with the right people at court beforehand. Duncan listened silently, without interrupting. The scout commander finished. He finished his flask of water. He stood up. He nodded. Not as a subordinate, but as a professional to a professional. His men rose. They went into the trees. Duncan returned to the castle by midday. Kyle listened to the report standing by the window. Duncan spoke evenly, without wasting words, point by point. 3 baronies, 3 titles, 3 months of negotiations, a petition in preparation. Roughly a month, maybe 6 weeks. When he finished, Kyle was silent. Not for long, about 30 seconds. It was his usual silence. Not confusion, but a space in which he was calculating. Then he walked over to the wall where the local map hung. 3 baronies, he found them all. Small, limited resources. Erden depends on trade transit to the east. Paula depends on grain shipments from the north. The Mallicrasties operate a tiny copper mine that needs a regular customer. Needs. Specific, monetary, measurable. Kyle called Alice. When she entered, he simply pointed to the map. 3 dots. He handed her a sheet of paper with short notes on each barony. She read quickly. Then she looked up. He explained. She was not traveling as an envoy of the Duchy. She was traveling as a trade agent. Offers each baron a specific deal, what they need at a fair price with clear terms. Doesn't ask them to give up Velen. He doesn't mention the petition. He's simply offering to trade. Alice looked at the notes. Erden needs a reliable transit route. The Asterholm Bridge gives him a bypass of the Velen outposts. Polak needs grain. Asterholm now has contracts with 3 grain traders crossing the bridge. The small Crasts need a buyer for copper. Kyle had blacksmiths who had just started working and would soon need raw materials. All of this was real. All of this was needed now. All of this cost real money. Velen was offering the 3 barons a political coalition and a pie in the bush. Kyle was offering a bird in the hand right now. Alice nodded. She started getting ready. She paused at the door, wondering how much time she had for all 3. Kyle looked at the map. He answered, as many as needed. Just faster than a month. 3 baronies, 3 different vulnerabilities, 3 different solutions, each with their own. This is what made the plan work. Alice didn't offer everyone the same thing. She offered each person what they specifically needed. This wasn't a political maneuver, but a trade operation. And in a trade operation, the one with the best product wins. It worked. Duncan, who had been watching this conversation from the door, said quietly, simply stating that Velen had been gathering allies for 6 months. Kyle broke it in one conversation at the map. Kyle replied, no, Alice will break it. That's her job. 2 years. The narrator could count the numbers again. Debt, production, revenue. But it's better to walk through Asterholm and just look. The road is solid even in the autumn slush. Rhine installed drainage gutters along the edges in the summer. Now the water drains away instead of standing. The bridge over the river can be heard from the eastern approach before it can be seen. The special rhythm of wheels on wood, which has already become part of the landscape here. The market is covered with a roof over 3/4 of the area. The canopy was erected in the fall to keep trade going during the rain. It is now open 6 days a week. Horses are always parked at the gate. The innkeeper, who has opened a temporary inn 2 houses from the market, has no vacancies on Fridays. The mine completed its first full month of production. The Silver Bank received its first report on the collateral. It said everything was in order. 12 houses were built in a year. 8 families arrived and stayed, not just looking around, but settling in, installing stoves and planting vegetable gardens. Children's voices became audible. This was an unexpected detail, but an important one. Children's voices are a sign that people are here for a reason. Debt, 10% of the original. A sum that 2 years ago seemed like never now looked like soon. Morden received reports from Asterholm every week. He read them carefully. He put them aside. He picked them up again. He had 30 years of experience assessing situations and people, and over these 30 years he has developed a simple rule. Behind any quick success, there is either luck or someone who organized it. Luck isn't systemic, so it's the organizer. He asked his advisor, "Who's behind this person?" The advisor answered honestly, "According to all sources, no one." Kyle Astern makes his own decisions, consults no outside advisors, and has no political patrons. His sales agent is Alice Marsh, the daughter of a bankrupt merchant. The guard's knight was Duncan, a former soldier of no noble birth. Morden stared at the table for a long moment. Then he said out loud, more to himself than to his advisor, "This is the worst part." Velen quietly wound down his northern operation that same month. 2 of the 3 baronies he was working on withdrew from negotiations. Alice had visited there a week earlier with concrete proposals. Erden signed a 5-year transit agreement and received priority access to the Asterholm Bridge. Pollock negotiated guaranteed grain supplies at a fixed price for 3 seasons in advance. Mallycrasty didn't sign anything, but they weren't part of the petition either. It turned out that the copper ore they were mining had found a new buyer through the Asterholm blacksmiths. The Baron didn't want to spoil that relationship. Without 3 signatures, Velen's legal maneuver collapsed like a house of cards. Velen suffered a beautiful setback, for which no one can be formally blamed. Then a moment occurred that will be remembered in different ways. It was late autumn, the penultimate trading week before the winter lull. Alice found Kyle in the courtyard, where he was reviewing the mine's winter security plan with Duncan. She found him quickly, with the air of someone who needed to show something. 11 heavily laden carts stood at the market gates. They weren't from the neighboring town, nor from the nearest barony. The markings on the sides were unfamiliar. The stamp on the travel document, the same. The leading merchant climbed down from his box, dark-skinned, with an accent that demanded attention to understand. He held papers bearing the seal of a trading house operating from another kingdom. Not a neighboring one. A different one. One with a different language, a different coin, different weights. They came because they heard it. One merchant told another merchant who told another. The chain stretched across 3 borders and reached the trading house, which specialized in new routes. They came to see if there was permanent trade here, and if so, to negotiate it. Kyle looked at the carts, then at Alice. Neither of them said anything. Words were superfluous. Then he said only one thing: a good stable, good food, negotiations in the morning. This wasn't just a merchant from distant lands. It was a signal that needed no decoding. Trade routes don't go to places unknown. They go to places talked about. Asterholm was now a place talked about, in another kingdom. Kyle thought about this for a long time, about how they hadn't invited anyone specifically, about how the merchant had come because another merchant had told him, and he did it because the third one told him. A chain that doesn't need to be built. It builds itself if there's something real at its foundation. Gaston mentioned one morning that there was a new sound in the castle. Kyle didn't immediately understand what it was. Then he listened. From below, from the marketplace, not individual voices, but a general hum. That steady background noise that exists in every living place. A village where this noise is present is alive. Where it isn't, it's dying or hasn't yet been born. 2 years ago, there was no such sound in Asterholm. That evening, Gaston set 2 glasses on the table. Kyle sat by the window long after the wine was gone. I looked into the darkness beyond the glass. Beyond the darkness was a road. Beyond the road, a bridge. Beyond the bridge, routes that led ever further. Asterholm looked different at the beginning of his 3rd year. Not dramatically so. It wasn't like a caterpillar turning into a butterfly overnight. This was different. Each individual detail was small, but together they formed a completely different picture. 12 new houses along the main street, the forge with its new furnace and chimney, the market square with a real covered gallery on 3 sides. It took all summer to build and was completed in September. A 2-story inn, still without a sign, but already filled with guests. The cobblestone approach to the bridge, 100 meters, was a small matter, but it spoke volumes. The northern forest no longer frightened any village. 4 different teams cut it down in shifts, and those who had initially crossed themselves at the edge now carried their wages from there. At court, people talked about Asterholm differently. There are no neutral conversations about success at court. Every opinion had its bearer, and each carrier had its own interests. The northern baron, whose access to transit through Velen was blocked by Asterholm, spoke of an unstable precedent and the dangers of uncontrolled growth in peripheral areas. A trading house that had just signed a contract across the Asterholm Bridge spoke of a model example of recovery. The royal treasurer remained silent, believing that if this were to scale, a revision of the tax zones was inevitable. 3 different conversations, 3 different conclusions. One name at the center. The lesser neighboring lords, those who for years had looked upon the ruined duchy as a warning, now looked upon it differently, and many were unwilling to acknowledge what this view meant. Several asked through intermediaries for trade agreements. One came in person, and he left with a contract for deliveries across the Asterholm Bridge. The merchant guilds discussed routes. The Trade Council considered revising tariff zones. Somewhere in banking circles, Kyle Astern's name was mentioned alongside those worth keeping an eye on. Raymond walked the market alone, without secretaries, in ordinary clothes, like a man simply observing. This was his method. Lawyers read documents. He reads people himself. He spoke to the merchants briefly, in a businesslike manner, without introductions. He asked about the fees, about disputes, about whether they were returning. The answers were the same. Yes, they come back because it's honest and stable here. Stable was a word he'd heard several times, from different people, in different formulations. This is not a coincidence. It is either a well-planned answer or the truth. Raymond wasn't sure which was worse. Prince Raymond decided to see for himself. The official reason, checking compliance with trade regulations in the northern duchies. Raymond brought 12 men, with secretaries, with an appraiser, with a lawyer. Everything according to the rules. Kyle greeted them as one would an official delegation, with the necessary protocol, without unnecessary words. Raymond worked for 3 days. He was not like Velen, not smug, not seeking humiliation. He was sharp and attentive, and I looked without bias, which in itself was more dangerous than any bias. The market. The documentation is complete, the fees are legal, there are no complaints. Road. Maintained at the duchy's expense. Tariffs within established limits. Mine. Mining license in order. Monthly reports to the mining inspectorate submitted promptly. The bridge. Private infrastructure on private land. Legally flawless. Nothing to take. Nothing at all. Raymond noticed this, and the very flawlessness became a signal to him. Not violations, but the absence of them. This paperwork arrangement doesn't arise by chance. It's prepared for inspection, and it's prepared well in advance. So, either someone warned about the visit or everything just sits here like that. Both possibilities pointed to the same thing. This duke thinks one step ahead, not just one. The prince's official report following the visit was neutral. The Duchy of Asterholm is operating within the law with no violations identified. The private conclusion was different. Raymond wrote it in a personal letter to a trusted advisor. Asterholm is not a place where things just happen. This is a project, and the project has an architect. Follow up. On the 4th day, the delegation left. Not all of it. One person remained, a certain Arnold, officially to complete customs protocol. Young, inconspicuous, with a good memory for faces. Arnold was young, well-trained, with that special invisibility that is achieved not by natural appearance, but by many years of practice. He knew how to look without looking, listen without turning his head, and ask questions in such a way that the other person perceives them as small talk. Alice didn't know this. She just knew that traders don't look at mine fences that way. Alice noticed him on the 2nd day after the prince's departure. He was hanging around the market without any apparent purpose, but 3 times that morning he found himself in a place from where the entrance to the mine yard was visible. A textile merchant doesn't behave like that. The official inspection took 3 full days. Raymond found nothing because there really was nothing. Kyle kept all his documents in order from the 1st month, long before any audit. It was an investment, several hours each week on documentation, which now cost the prince's peaceful departure without result. She reported to Duncan that evening. He nodded. He already knew. Duncan didn't wait for orders. He began observing from the very first day, as soon as he saw Arnold looking at people instead of goods. Military intelligence teaches one fundamental rule. You need to see a person several times in different contexts before drawing conclusions. Once is a coincidence. 2 times is a coincidence. 3 times is a pattern. Duncan saw Arnold 7 times in 3 days, each time in a different place, but always near something of operational significance. It was a system, a good, orderly one at that. He respected the work, even when it worked against him. 2 weeks, methodically, without rushing. He knew how to do this without the target noticing a thing. Over the years, he developed a rule. Never look directly. Always know where the person is eating. Arnold was professional, but not exceptional. He knew his stuff well enough to avoid obvious mistakes. Not well enough to avoid making mistakes in front of Duncan. 3 things came together to form a picture. First, the routes. Arnold regularly visited 3 points: the market entrance, the mine yard, and the new residential areas. This isn't a commercial interest, it's infrastructure reconnaissance. Second, correspondence. He had a courier, a local messenger hired through the inn. Letters were sent to the capital every 4 days. Duncan contacted the courier through Rain, who was repairing his wheelbarrow. The content of the letters was standard court code. Duncan had spent 20 years in the military and knew this code like the back of his hand. Third, and most importantly, the letters were addressed to 2 people. The first expected one is Prince Raymond. Reports on the mine, market turnover, and contracts. Analytics for anyone who wants to understand Astorholm's importance in the regional economy. The second recipient was Morden. And here the content was different. Not economics. Kyle's routes, the mine's security schedule, weak points in the northern perimeter fence. This isn't an analysis. It's preparation for action. Raymond and Morden worked together. The prince wanted control of the rapidly growing duchy. The banker wanted revenge. Different goals, one target. Duncan reported to Kyle that evening, briefly and point by point. Kyle listened, standing, motionless. When Duncan finished, he asked one question. Did Arnold know he'd been exposed? No. Silence. About 20 seconds. Then Kyle said, "Let him get to work." Duncan looked at him. It wasn't, "Don't touch him for now," or "Keep an eye on him." It was a conscious decision, to keep the agent as a live conduit. They called Alice. The next 2 evenings, working, practical, and without further ado, were spent constructing what Alice privately called a picture for others' eyes. The material for Arnold was carefully prepared. Almost everything was true. The figures were genuine. The details were authentic. Only a few elements were shifted. The first quarter production report showed actual tons, but with a hint of higher than actual operating costs. One of the trading contracts was presented in a conversation between 2 specially positioned people in the market as in question. In fact, it was signed and in effect. The silver bank loan figured in the same conversations as being more burdensome than expected. The goal is simple. Astorholm is slightly weaker than it already is. It's not collapsing. That would trigger immediate action. It's simply more vulnerable than it appears. A signal to the patient enemy. Wait a little longer. The moment will come. While they wait, the mine will reach full capacity. The silver loan will be repaid. Agreements that now seem fragile will strengthen. The window Raymond and Morden chose to wait for will slam shut. Arnold spent the next 3 days seeing exactly what had been prepared for him. He was attentive, professional, and methodical. He didn't miss a single clue. He wrote everything down. He personally sealed the letter. The courier left Astorholm at dawn. 3 weeks later, Raymond moved Astorholm from immediate attention to monitoring low priority in his personal registry. He explained this to the advisor succinctly. There was no need to rush. The duchy had hidden costs. The moment would come on its own. Morden received a letter from Arnold that same day and told his secretary the same thing in almost the same words. Disinformation only works if it looks like an overheard truth. The deliberate leaks by people who don't notice Arnold's presence were minimal and natural. No one overdid it. The conversations were genuine in tone, only the content was calibrated. It's a delicate job. Alice was unexpectedly good at it. She could sense when a detail sounded too prepared and removed it without regret. Neither of them knew they'd uttered the phrase that had been written for them. Kyle closed the folder containing the disinformation drafts and put it away in a drawer. I asked Alice how much time they'd gained. She thought for a moment and replied, "If they believe me, 3 months, maybe 4. They'll probably believe me." Kyle nodded. 4 months. That's how long it took to complete the second mine level, pay off the bank loan, and sign 3 contracts, which were currently in the final stages of negotiations. It was plenty. Raymond received Arnold's report and came to exactly the conclusion that had been prepared for him. Asterholm was working, but incurring hidden costs. The loan is more burdensome than it appears from the outside. One contract is in question. The pressure is on now while there's vulnerability. He announced a tax audit. Official, with royal powers, public. Formally, it was a scheduled audit of the Northern Territories. In reality, it's pressure through procedure. Freezing some financial transactions, 2 to 3 weeks of paperwork hell, and a show of attention from the court. For a duchy in a fragile position, this could have been significant. The disinformation worked on 2 levels. The first is tactical. Delay the enemy. Buy time. The second, which Kyle didn't mention out loud, is strategic. Force them into a public lurch. Morden and Raymond are used to working in the shadows. Opaque deals, closed boards, quiet agreements. If they want to put pressure on Asterholm officially, they'll come out into the open. And in the open, the rules are different. Raymond chose the public move. That was exactly what was needed. He didn't know Kyle was waiting for it. The disinformation wasn't just designed to buy time. It was designed to provoke a specific type of action. Public, documented, official. Because a public move requires a public response. And a public response is an opportunity Kyle hasn't had before. The royal auditor arrived in Asterholm on Tuesday. Young, competent, and clearly expecting resistance. He'd been told that provincial dukes tended to get confused in their paperwork or lose necessary books. Kyle met him at the castle, where a work table was laid out in the main hall. 3 years of records, each document in a separate folder with a date and number, each transaction with 2 signatures. The registers were kept from the first month, even before the first income came in. The table was set for 3 people: the auditor, his assistant, and Alice, who answered questions. The auditor worked for 3 days. He left on the 4th. The official report submitted to the Trade Council stated that the financial statements of the Duchy of Asterholm were maintained in full compliance with the requirements. No violations were found. But the audit triggered a mechanism Raymond hadn't considered. When a duchy's financial status is submitted for official review, it means the data becomes available to the Trade Council. Kyle asked for a hearing. Standard procedure. The party under investigation can present their case. He was granted the floor. He stood before the council and laid out the figures. Not defending himself, but reporting. Calmly, point by point, without rhetoric. 3 years in numbers. Where we started, where we are now. The council listened silently. Not because the numbers were pretty, because they were impossible. By all the standards the council applied to provincial duchies, the debt abyss that was on everyone's lips 3 years ago has been reduced to 0. Market turnover over the last quarter placed Asterholm in the top third of the Northern Territories in terms of trading activity. The bridge generated more transit revenue than 3 comparable crossings in neighboring states combined. The mine delivered the first batch of silver-bearing ore and paid the bank's security deposit on time. The advisors listened with that special silence that occurs when intelligent people understand that they are being shown something that breaks out of the framework of their usual categories. Asterholm was a name in the problem areas column. Judging by the numbers, he should have been moved to another column long ago, but no one was paying attention. The audit, which was supposed to humiliate Kyle, forced them to watch. One of the advisors, the oldest in the room, remembered how this same northern region had appeared in the registers 20 years ago, as a promising one. He looked at the latest figures and thought the potential was still there. Someone had simply spotted it. Several advisors exchanged glances. One asked to repeat the last number more slowly. Kyle repeated it. That same evening, the report landed on the royal treasurer's desk. The treasurer took it to the king. The king read it. Then he put it aside. He asked the advisor quietly, without much expression, As one might ask about a person one wants to know better. Who is Duke Astern? The advisor explained, young, an inheritance ruined 3 years ago, a debt that can't be repaid. Then this. The king was silent. Then he uttered one phrase. I want to meet him. 4 words. They reached Raymond by the next morning. Morden 2 days later. Both instantly understood one thing. The duke the king wanted was a duke they could not oppose openly, at least not now. The king's words, 4 words, spread quickly. At court, a monarch's words travel in a special way, not because they're passed on, but because those who need to know always know. By evening, 6 people knew. By the next morning, 20. 3 days later, everyone who cared about it. Raymond, upon receiving the news, sat motionless for several minutes. Then he asked that all active missions related to Asterholm be removed. Not canceled, but removed from view. Temporarily. Morden reacted differently. He didn't remove tasks. He accelerated them. The audit Raymond had launched as an attack became a platform. The trap snapped shut, just not the one the prince had set. Morden received word of the king's words through his own men at court. It took 5 days. He pored over the report for a long time. Then he put it away in the drawer. Then he took it out. Then he put it away again. Every legal move had been exhausted. Debt pressure, paid. Creditors' counsel, defeated. Ferry, bypassed by a bridge. Baronial coalition, disintegrated. Audit, passed flawlessly. Disinformation only bought a reprieve, and now it's completely pointless. The political space has closed with one royal phrase. Morden made the decision people make when the rules run out and only the outcome remains. 30 years of business teach one thing. There's always one more move. Not necessarily beautiful, not necessarily clean. Just a move. Morden was a pragmatist to the core. Not a villain, not an avenger. Simply a man for whom failure was a category that could not be ignored. He hired people through 3 intermediaries. Professionals, not street thugs, but people with a reputation for their shady craft. He set clear terms. No noise, no traces, no witnesses. Payment based on results. He didn't think of it as murder in the moral sense. He thought of it as closing a position. He hired people. Not his own, but outsiders. Professionals, anonymous, without a trace. The conditions were simple. Not in a castle, not in the open, at night, in the city, quickly. Payment is made only upon delivery. Kyle was in the trading town late in the evening. A meeting with a grain trading house had dragged on until dark. I returned on foot along a short road that I knew well. Between 2 rows of houses, an unlit area, about 40 meters. The darkness between the houses was real. No torches, no moon that evening. The first one came out on the left, the second on the right, the third behind. A proper distribution for 3 people. Professional work. Duncan reacted before the first one had time to fully exit. People with a military background have peripheral vision that reads movement in the dark differently, not by images, but by a change in space. Something shifted to the left before it became visible. He was already moving. The first one never understood what had happened. The second one understood, but it was too late. The third one saw everything and made the right decision. 3 people emerged from the shadows between the buildings. Duncan walked 3 steps behind. 30 years of military service is neither a memory nor a skill. It's the body that reacts before the mind has time to think. He didn't assess the situation. He simply moved forward and stood between Kyle and the first of the 3. The first one got a shoulder in the nose and a wall in the back of the head at the same time. He didn't understand what happened until he fell down. Duncan dealt with the second one with 2 moves. Grab, turn, throw. The third one saw the first 2, assessed the situation, and ran. It all took a few seconds. Duncan pressed his palm to his left forearm. One of the first 2 managed to draw a knife. The blade slid across his arm, not deep, but enough. The blood was flowing fast. Kyle looked at the wound. Not at the 2 on the ground, not at the third. At the wound. His face was different. Not calculating. the kind people have when something affects them personally. Not grief, not fear, something quieter and more real. Duncan had seen many faces after the battle. This was what he remembered. At Duncan's castle, a physician examined him. The wound was clean, the muscles were intact, and it would heal in 3 weeks. Kyle sat nearby during the examination. Then he went off to his room without a word. In the morning, he went out into the courtyard, mounted his horse, alone, unarmed, unescorted, and rode toward the capital's highway. Gaston looked after him with the expression of a man who wants to say something and understands that talking is useless. Kyle was on his way to Morden's. He arrived around noon. He entered alone. The servants let him in. The door to the office opened and closed. An hour and a few minutes passed. None of the servants heard a scream or the sound of a struggle. Only a quiet conversation behind a closed door. Then footsteps. The door opened. Kyle walked out first. He walked through the hall without stopping. The servant at the entrance opened the door. He mounted his horse and rode away. Morden followed him out onto the porch, no further. He stood up. He watched the horseman retreat. The servants who saw him at that moment later spoke differently. Some said he was pale. Others said he simply stood there for a long time. What exactly Kyle said to Morden in that closed office? No one knew, and no one ever will. The servants heard only intonations. The even voice of the young Duke and the silence of the master. Almost no words of response. The long silence that was not consent was the kind of silence when a person is told something from which there is no defense. Morden's advisor, who had known the owner for 20 years, would later say that something broke that day. Not his character, not his will, something else. Confidence that he had the moves. The advisor who came to him that evening with papers to sign described it more precisely. The owner sat at the table and stared at one point, like a man who had been told something he didn't want to hear, and now he knew it and could no longer not know it. The next day, Morden wrote 3 letters to his solicitor. These included orders for the sale of assets, retail properties in the capital, 2 bill portfolios, and a stake in a shipping partnership. Quietly, no explanation, just sell. Duncan was the 5th son in a family where 5th son is a nice number of children, but not a man with a future. He passed away at 15, not because life was bad, but because it was clear that what he needed wouldn't be found here. He went where the 5th sons with a straight back and the ability to endure go, into military service. Not nightly, but garrison. Guards, patrols, dirty work in good weather and bad. He learned, endured, and became better. At 25, he was called to Asterholm. The old Duke wasn't evil. That's important to say. He was weak, which is sometimes worse. The evil one creates enemies. The weak one creates emptiness, and emptiness sucks everything around. Duncan watched the duchy slowly crumble, year after year without catastrophe, just a quiet decline. He tried to be useful where he could. He was almost useless. When they stopped paying him, the 6th month, the 7th, he left. No hatred, no resentment. The situation was such that staying would have meant dying along with something that was already dead. He was a professional, not a martyr. 3 years in the South. 2 barons, both decent employers, nothing special. Good pay, proper work. An emptiness inside that he didn't name because it was easier that way. Then rumors. At first, funny ones. A ruined duke is trading timber. Then more interesting ones. He's building a bridge. Then one man whom Duncan trusted, an old colleague who had passed through the north, told him personally, "I saw this boy pushing a wheelbarrow with stones next to the peasants. Not for show, for real." Duncan was silent for a few minutes after that. Then he asked, "How long ago?" 2 months ago, a colleague replied. Duncan submitted his resignation the following week. He wasn't expecting a formal reception. He didn't expect forgiveness. He didn't believe he'd done anything deserving of forgiveness. He was expecting an assessment and conditions. Instead, he got 3 words and a turn. "It's good you came." That's all. It was incomprehensible. Duncan spent several days in bewilderment, trying to figure out what exactly had happened. During his 15 years of service, Duncan worked for 5 masters. 2 of them were good commanders, tough, fair, and respectful of the work. One was bad and admitted it. One was mediocre and didn't admit it. Old Duke Astern was weak and suffered for it. All five viewed people in a certain way, as a resource with varying degrees of value. This wasn't cynical. It was simply a way to maintain distance, which helped make difficult decisions. A resource can be lost. A person can too, but that's more complicated. Kyle looked at people differently. Duncan didn't notice it right away. It took months, through a series of small moments. Kyle remembered the names. Not the servants, not the knights. Everyone. The woodcutter with the bad back who'd been given an easier section. The village widow, to whom Gaston brought food once a week on unspoken orders. The old miner Peter, who wasn't just hired but asked. It wasn't kindness as a policy. It was simply a habit of seeing people. Then I stopped trying and started working. His injured forearm was healing well, but slowly. The doctor had ordered him to take it easy. Duncan lay in his room on the ground floor, frustrated by his forced idleness, and read. Kyle came every morning. It wasn't long, 5 minutes, rarely 10. He brought food himself, without a servant, a plate, bread, sometimes something hot from Gaston. He sat down, asked about the hand, listened to the answer, left. Every day. On the third day, Duncan stopped being surprised and simply accepted it as a fact. By the 6th, he noticed he was starting to look forward to those 5 minutes. Not because he needed the company, but because there was something in them he hadn't felt in a long time. That his presence here was significant not as a function, but in itself. On the 13th day, he sat down at the table and had a normal breakfast when Kyle arrived. He set down the plate, saw that Duncan was already sitting upright, and assessed the condition of his hand by the way he held the spoon. He nodded silently. Duncan looked at him. For a long second. Then he said his name. Not his title. Not Duke. Just his name. Kyle put the mug on the table. He looked at Duncan. He didn't answer or correct him. Name. One word instead of a title. In the army, this matters. They clearly distinguish between addressing people by their position and by their name. The former refers to the role, the latter to the person. Soldiers call those they trust by their first names. Officers call those they respect by their first names. When a direction changes, it means something else. That there is a hierarchy, but it is no longer the only form of relationship between them. Duncan said a name. Kyle didn't correct him. The moment was brief. No one but the two of them noticed. But it's these little moments, the ones that aren't recorded or announced, that define what's really going on between people. The silence between them was calm. Then footsteps in the hallway. Gaston's, faster than usual. He entered with a letter. Official seal, sealed wax. Prince Raymond formally summoned Duke Astern to court. The wording was precise, the tone impeccable. Essentially, it was an order wrapped in an invitation. Kyle read it, folded it, placed it on the edge of the table next to the mug, looked at Duncan, asked calmly, how much longer until his hand was back to normal? Duncan wiggled his fingers. He assessed. A week and a half, maybe 2. Kyle nodded. He replied, then we'll leave in 2 weeks. Kyle entered the capital with a small entourage. 8 people. Not because he lacked the resources, because each of the 8 had been chosen with the same precision, with which everything in Asterholm is chosen, not for show, but for business. Gaston, because he knew court protocol by heart. Alice, because every conversation here was somehow commercial. Duncan, because he could read people in halls as well as in dark alleys. The other 5 are servants with the necessary skills. No banners, no unnecessary glitter. Just properly dressed men on good horses. The courtyard was a different world, not in the sense that it was more beautiful or richer, though both were present. In the sense that different laws operated here. In Asterholm, real things were valued. How many logs came out of the forest? How many coins entered the treasury? Here, something else was valued. Who was talking to whom? How long the pause was. Gaston walked alongside, quietly naming names and statuses. This advisor, that woman is the secretary, this young man in blue is the chancellor's nephew. Kyle listened, memorized, and asked no questions. The meeting was public. Raymond had managed to get Asterholm included on the official agenda. Officially, it's a model of active development. In reality, it's a public stage where questions can be asked in public and on the record. Kyle stood before the council. Behind him in the hall were 20 nobles, advisors, and secretaries. Raymond sat to the side, looking like an interested observer. The questions began immediately. Where did the funds come from for the one-time debt repayment 3 years ago? Kyle named the trade agreements by name and amount. Is it true that foreign banking houses have a shareholding interest in the mining operation? No. There was a secured loan, repaid 6 months ago. How did the mine achieve the stated production volumes in its first year? Kyle answered each question briefly, concretely, with figures or references to documents. Not a single answer was longer than the question demanded. Not a single unnecessary word. The audience listened. Raymond searched for the edge, the place where the answer would falter. He couldn't find it. Every question he'd set as a trap received an answer that sealed the trap from the inside. Several nobles in the hall began exchanging glances. A public interrogation of a duke who did not get nervous, did not apologize, but simply answered methodically was a rarity. Then the king spoke. He had been silent the entire time, sitting slightly to the side, in a chair that wasn't specifically singled out, but was prominent to everyone. When the formal part was over, in a pause, he said, quietly, without any particular intonation, he had heard that the Astorholm market welcomes traders from the Western lands. I'd like to know more. 4 words, plus clarification. But this was the king, and he was speaking directly to a specific duke. The audience understood instantly. Kyle answered, calmly, with details, without theatrics. Western traders showed up on their own. Their reputation generated traffic. Currently, 4 houses represent them. A 5th is negotiating. The king nodded. He said, interesting. He turned away. That was enough. Gaston worked in silence, softly, almost unnoticed. The right bow at the right moment, the perfect pause, the impeccable seating arrangements at a gala dinner. Alice observed the courtiers differently, professionally. She looked for what a good merchant looks for in every conversation, genuine interest beneath the polite surface. I found out. Several nobles were asking about Astorholm, not because it was their duty, but because they wanted to know. On the way back to the inn, Duncan walked beside them and said nothing. At the inn door, a young man from the hall approached Kyle, an unfamiliar figure from a small western duchy. He briefly introduced himself and said he'd like to discuss the terms. The third person that day with the same question. Raymond left before the end of the formal dinner, unexpectedly, without the usual farewells. His advisor stayed behind and spent another hour at the table, talking with sales representatives and taking notes. Then he, too, left. Duncan witnessed it all. I reported briefly to Kyle. Raymond is thinking. The advisor is gathering information. This is a different type of reaction than before. Kyle listened, nodded, said, so he's moving from pressure to evaluation. That's progress. Kyle passed it on to Alice. 3 years. The narrator could have started with numbers again, but numbers here speak for themselves only if you understand their scale. So, first people, 300 families. That's 300 individual decisions, to leave what they have and move to a place rumored to be better. Decisions made without guarantees. 300 times someone packed up and believed. Now children grew up in Astorholm who didn't know there was anything else here. For them, it was just home. The market operated 6 days a week in 3 shifts. On peak days, the number of stalls exceeded 120. An unfamiliar voice could be heard at the eastern end. 5 trading kingdoms. They had no representatives. They traded regularly, maintained warehouses, and planned routes through Astorholm in advance. The mine produced gold on 4 levels. The Silver Bank received its final loan payment 6 months ago, early, without any negotiations. The bank's chief agent wrote a personal letter proposing to discuss new terms of cooperation. Alice accepted the letter and responded, next quarter. The road was widened, and signs appeared, the first in the duchy's history, in 3 languages, indicating distances to nearby towns. Morden left the capital in November, quietly, without announcement. He sold his townhouse. Word was he'd moved to the coast, a small estate, a quiet life. The word broke wasn't used. He was too experienced to let the situation devolve into bankruptcy. But those in the know understood the arithmetic without words. Morden's story didn't end with a bang or public disgrace. It simply died down. His mansion changed hands. His trading assets were dispersed among small buyers. His name surfaced in Asterholm once. A market trader mentioned hearing about a former banker. Kyle heard it. He said nothing. 3 more streets sprang up in the town. A small school opened. Dora insisted. Kyle donated the building. A teacher was found through an ad in the capital. Rain the blacksmith now had 4 assistants. His middle son was engaged to a girl from a displaced family. The first wedding with roots in 3 different lands. Peter went to the mine every day. Not because he was asked to, but because he couldn't help himself. This was his place. Now it was working. Then a letter arrived from Velen. A beautiful letter. Formal, with 2 seals, on good paper. Duke Velen congratulated Asterholm on her achievements. The same Velen who, 2 years ago, tried to buy up the northern forest for next to nothing. Who built a coalition to establish a regency. Who sent scouts. Now he was asking to trade. Kyle read the letter over breakfast. Silently, to the end. He put it aside. Then he laughed. Not politely, not curtly. He really did. Alice looked up from her papers and looked at him with an expression that was hard to describe more accurately than, "I didn't expect that sound." For 2.5 years, she'd heard him in various states. Focused, tired, coldly precise, once irritated. Never like this. Kyle put the letter down. He asked Alice to send a standard acknowledgement of receipt and suggest a meeting for next quarter. He picked up his mug. Velen's letter demanded restraint, which Alice was demanding at that moment. She composed her reply 3 times. The first too cold, the second too kind. The third one is just as businesslike as it needs to be. No hint of the past, just standard correspondence between 2 trading partners. Asterholm no longer needed to remember out loud. Alice looked at him for another second. Then she returned to her papers. But the corners of her mouth moved slightly. 3 years. Counting from the day Kyle rode onto the empty main street with the debt roll tucked under his arm. 3 years, exactly. Gaston said one evening that he couldn't understand when everything changed. It wasn't just one day. Every day was just a little more than the day before. And at some point, it suddenly became clear that there were a lot. Kyle replied that this was exactly how it should be. Remember the silence? The one with which this story began. The dense, deathly silence of an abandoned place. The weeds on the main road. The empty market square. Let's take the same route. Let's see what's happened. The main road is now wide enough for 2 carts to pass each other. Along the sides are drainage ditches and young trees. The market is heard before it's seen. Voices, several languages at once, merge into that special hum that all living markets around the world share. Covered galleries line 3 sides of the square. Over 100 stalls sit beneath the awnings. In the far corner, the scent of unfamiliar spices brought from the west wafts. The bridge glistens in the morning sun. From the other bank, where the timbers of someone else's ferry once rotted, a new road now leads, built without Asterholm's help. Villages, all 12 of them. Not all are the same. Some have grown up, some are just living. But each one has people, fires in the hearths, children on the streets. In the main hall of the castle, Alice was finishing negotiations. The trading house, Issel and Sons, is the largest trading intermediary of the far western kingdom, the very one from which the first unfamiliar convoy with incomprehensible seals arrived 3 years ago. They spent 2 days in Asterholm, inspecting the market, warehouse facilities, bridge, and road. They asked the right questions and received straightforward answers. Now on the table lay a contract, a 5-year agreement for regular purchases. The largest single trade contract in the history of the Duchy. Alice took the pen. She signed. She affixed her seal. She set the pen down. I stared at the signature for a second. I thought about my father, about what he used to say. Large-scale trading always ends with someone stronger coming through. He wasn't wrong about his world. It's just that the world has changed, or the world has remained the same, but the method has. She folded the contract and handed it to her partner. She stood up and left. Duncan stood at the gate. He'd been there every morning for the past few months. Not on duty, just standing and watching. At the stream of people, at the carts, at the faces. He couldn't have explained why exactly if asked. It was simply that this place now demanded to be seen, so that someone could stand there and understand what was going on here. 3 years ago, he arrived, not knowing what he would find. He found more than he expected. Not a salary or a job, though both existed. Something that has no simple name and that people usually understand only when it's already there. He watched as a family with 3 children and a cartload of belongings drove through the gates. More settlers. The youngest child looked around with the expression one has when looking at a new place when it seems alive. Duncan thought, "This child will grow up here. Never know what silence was like." Gaston found Kyle in the library. The same one where, 3 years ago, a thick folder of legal regulations had lain under a layer of dust. There was no dust now. There was order, there were new books, there was a map of the northern trade routes on the wall. The third one, because the first 2 were out of date. Gaston held the treasurer's quarterly report in his hands. He held it out. Kyle took it. He read it. He placed it on the table. Gaston looked at him. He wanted to say something. Something about what had happened over the years, about what he had seen with his own eyes, about what had been in Asterholm before and what was now. But the words fell short of what he had in mind, and he couldn't find the right ones. He said only one thing. Father wouldn't believe it. His voice wavered on the last word. Kyle looked at him, long, wordlessly. Then he did something Gaston had never seen him do. Briefly, for a second, he placed his hand on his shoulder, simply put it down and put it away. No explanation. That was enough. Sometimes just one gesture is enough to say, "I know, I hear, me too." That evening, when the castle had fallen silent, Kyle entered his office and closed the door. He walked over to the desk and opened the bottom drawer. There was a scroll inside. That same one, 1.5 meters of thick paper with small, cramped handwriting on both sides. A list of debts, names of creditors, amounts, deadlines. He kept it for 3 years, not as a reminder or a trophy. He simply didn't throw it away. He took it. He walked over to the fireplace. He sat down in front of the fire. He held the scroll in his hands, not reading it, just holding it. The paper was thick, slightly yellowed at the edges. I held the end to the flame. The fire started immediately. He walked slowly across the paper, from bottom to top, line by line, name by name, amount by amount. The wax from the broken seals hissed. The ink rose in a thin smoke. The paper blackened and curled. Kyle watched the fire. He didn't rush or interfere. I simply watched, with that calm, even attention with which one looks at things that have been going on for a long time and are now ending as they should. When the flame reached his fingers, he let go. The last piece fell into the fire. It burned out. All that remained was fire and silence. A different silence, not the one with which it all began. Asterholm lived outside the window. The market gate slammed. Somewhere in the distance, the creaking of a heavy cart on the bridge could be heard. The last convoy before the crossing closed for the night. They gave him ashes. He made gold from them. And those who watched him fall are already standing in line at his gate.